Welcome to the long night. Tonight you do not need to solve anything. You do not need to improve yourself, fix your thoughts, or force your body into sleep. You only need to let yourself arrive here gently, exactly as you are. Perhaps this day has felt heavy. Perhaps your mind has been crowded with unfinished thoughts, quiet worries, old conversations, or the strange restlessness that appears when the world grows quiet, and there is finally nothing left to distract you. If that is where you are tonight, then you are in the right place. For the next little while, let these words be something soft to rest beside. You do not need to hold on to every sentence. You do not need to stay alert for every idea. You may simply listen, breathe, and allow the mind to gradually loosen, just as a clenched hand slowly opens on its own when it realizes it no longer needs to grip so tightly. What we are entering tonight is not a lecture, and it is not a demand. It is a gentle path. Buddhism, in its simplest and most comforting form, is less like a system of rules and more like a quiet understanding of how the human mind creates suffering and how that suffering can begin to soften. It does not ask you to become someone else before peace is possible. It does not insist that you earn rest through perfection. Instead, it offers a calm and compassionate observation. Much of what troubles us does not come only from life itself, but from the way the mind reacts to life. We worry about what has not happened. We replay what cannot be changed. We reach for what we do not yet have and resist what is already here. In doing so, the mind keeps stirring the water and then wonders why it cannot see clearly. Buddhism is like a gentle hand resting on the rim of that glass, inviting stillness, not through force, but through understanding. You might imagine it as a medicine chest for the inner life. Not medicine for the body, but for anxiety, disappointment, anger, fear, and that quiet ache so many people carry without knowing how to name it. It is full of small, timeless remedies for the tired heart. The beautiful thing is that you do not need to adopt a new identity to benefit from them. You do not need to believe in anything supernatural. These teachings help because they are built on something direct and human. They are based on how the mind actually moves, how desire rises, how fear tightens, how thoughts repeat themselves, and how peace begins to return when we stop feeding every passing disturbance. They are practical in the deepest sense of the word, and the story of how these insights entered the world begins, as many great stories do, with someone who seemed to have everything. Long ago, about 2,500 years in the past, there lived a young prince, whom we will call Prince Anik. From the moment he was born, his life was wrapped in beauty, comfort, and protection. His father, King Varun, loved him so deeply that he tried to shield him from every form of pain, sorrow, or discomfort. The prince lived in magnificent palaces built for different seasons of the year. He wore soft and costly fabrics. He ate the finest foods. Music followed him. Dancers, poets, and servants filled the halls around him. Every need was anticipated before it fully arose. Even the sunlight and rain were softened for him, as though life itself had been instructed not to touch him too harshly. In time, he married a graceful young woman named Leora, and together they had a son. By the measures most people trust, Prince Anik had been given a perfect life. And yet deep within that carefully arranged beauty, something remained unsettled. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was not the kind of pain that announces itself clearly. It was more like a faint emptiness moving quietly beneath everything pleasant. The music still played, but it did not answer the question rising in his heart. The silk was soft, but it could not soothe the unnamed longing within him. The banquets, the gardens, the laughter, the admiration, all of it passed before him like golden light over water, lovely for a moment, then gone again. He began to feel what many people feel, though few speak of it openly, that outer comfort and inner peace are not always the same thing. A life can appear full and still leave the heart asking for something more honest, more lasting, more real. Perhaps you have felt this too. Perhaps there have been moments in your own life when you reached something you thought would complete you, a job you wanted, a home you worked hard to build, a purchase you convinced yourself would finally make life feel settled, a relationship, a milestone, a future plan that seemed to promise arrival, and perhaps for a little while it did feel satisfying. But then the feeling faded, as feelings do, and something in you remained awake, still searching, still asking. In our modern world, we build our own palaces in quieter ways. We surround ourselves with noise, busyness, entertainment, endless, scrolling, constant stimulation, full schedules, little comforts, and private distractions. We tell ourselves that if we can just arrange life a little better, earn a little more, become a little more admired, a little more secure, a little more certain, then perhaps peace will finally stay. But often, like Prince Anik, we discover that no outer arrangement can fully touch the deeper restlessness of the heart. This quiet unrest did not mean there was something wrong with the prince. In truth, it was the beginning of wisdom. Something within him was waking up, not into despair, but into honesty, not into rejection of life, but into a longing to understand it more deeply. He could sense, though he could not yet explain, that behind pleasure and comfort, there was still a larger truth waiting to be seen. He began to wonder what existed beyond the sheltered walls of his beautiful world. He began to feel drawn toward the parts of life that had been kept from him. And in that gentle stirring, the whole journey truly began. Because sometimes the first sign of awakening is not joy, but the quiet realization that what once seemed enough no longer reaches the deepest part of you. So tonight, as you rest here and listen, there is no need to hurry ahead. Let this beginning be enough. Let the mind soften around the simple truth that peace does not always begin with answers. Sometimes it begins with the courage to notice that all the noise, all the effort, and all the endless reaching have not brought the rest you hoped they would. Sometimes it begins with a question asked very quietly in the dark, and sometimes that question becomes the doorway to an entirely different life. In the next part, we will follow Prince Anik beyond the palace walls, where the first great turning of his heart begins. In time, the quiet unrest within Prince Anik became impossible to ignore. It followed him through music and laughter. It lingered in the gardens after celebrations had ended. It remained with him even in the tender hours he shared with Leora and their young son. The more beautiful and protected his life appeared, the more clearly he could feel that something essential was still hidden from him. At last, against the wishes of King Varan, he asked to leave the palace grounds and see the world beyond the walls. Until then, Nearly everything around him had been carefully arranged. Beauty had been placed before him. Discomfort had been kept at a distance. Harshness had been softened before it could reach his eyes. But the world beyond the palace was not designed for comfort, and on the day he passed through those gates, the sheltered shape of his life began to break open. On that first journey, Prince Anik saw an old man walking slowly along the roadside. His back was bent, his hands trembled, his face was lined with time, and each step seemed to require effort. The prince stared in astonishment. He had never seen a body altered so completely by age. He turned to his driver and asked what had happened to the man. Had he been injured? Had some misfortune singled him out? The driver answered as gently as he could. "No, my prince. This is simply old age. If a person lives long enough, the body changes in this way. Strength fades. Beauty shifts. The years leave their marks on everyone. On everyone." The words did not leave him. Prince Anik looked again at the old man and felt the first deep crack in the dream he had been living. He thought of his own strong body, his easy step, the smoothness of youth that had always seemed so natural. He thought of Leora. He thought of his small son. Could this truly come for all of them? Could all that seemed bright and vigorous one day bend and thin and tremble? The question settled in him with unusual weight. It did not feel cruel. It felt undeniable. On another journey, he saw a man overcome by illness. The figure was pale and shaking, his face tightened with pain, his body no longer obedient to his will. Again, the prince asked what strange thing had happened. Again, the answer was simple. "Sickness comes to all people," said the driver, "whether they are rich or poor, admired or forgotten. No wealth can command the body to remain forever well. No title can keep suffering outside the door forever." Something in Prince Anik grew still as he listened. In the palace, comfort had seemed reliable. Health had seemed almost like a law of nature. Yet here before him was another truth, plain and human. A body could weaken, breath could turn ragged, pain could enter any life without asking permission. He felt no superiority over the suffering man, only a sudden closeness, as though the distance between prince and stranger had dissolved. For the first time, compassion rose in him, not as an idea, but as something immediate and living. The pain of another no longer seemed like a distant event. It felt woven into the same fragile fabric as his own life. Then came the third sight. A funeral procession moved slowly down the road, quiet and solemn. Faces were wet with grief. Voices were hushed. Flowers were carried in trembling hands. And at the center of it all was a body being taken away, still and unmoving. Prince Anik felt a chill pass through him. He asked what this meant, though some part of him already knew. The driver told him that the person had died, and that death was the fate awaiting every living being, not only the poor, not only the weak, not only strangers in faraway places, but everyone, kings, queens, beloved wives, sons, friends, and one day, the prince himself. It is hard to describe what such knowledge does when it is truly seen for the first time. Many people hear of death and turn away before it enters the heart. But Prince Anik did not turn away. He let it reach him. He let it disturb him. He let it ask its full question. If aging cannot be avoided, if sickness cannot be bargained with, if death comes to every life, without exception, then what is all this striving for? What kind of happiness can survive such truths? What kind of peace can remain when everything the heart clings to must one day change, fade, or disappear? These sights did not make him hopeless. They made him honest. They awakened in him a sorrow deeper than personal disappointment and a compassion wider than private concern. He began to understand that the unease he had felt in the palace was not a defect in his life. It was a response to a reality that had been hidden from him. All around the world, people were facing loss, pain, fear, separation, and the uncertainty of not knowing what tomorrow would bring. And yet most continued on searching, hoping, loving, grieving, enduring. How he wondered, could anyone live in such a world and still find a peace that was genuine and lasting? Then on another journey beyond the palace, he saw someone entirely different. It was a wandering monk, dressed simply, carrying almost nothing. There was no wealth around him, no fine shelter, no attendants, no signs of power. And yet his face held a kind of calm that Prince Anik had never seen before. It was not the calm of comfort. It was not the ease of someone whose life had been arranged to avoid difficulty. It was something quieter and deeper. The monk seemed to carry a peace that did not depend on possessions, praise, or favorable conditions. He had very little, and yet there was no poverty in his eyes. There was a steadiness there, an inner contentment that did not ask the world to become different before it could rest. That image stayed with the prince more powerfully than all the luxury of the palace ever had. That night, when the palace had grown quiet and the air had settled into the stillness before dawn, Prince Anik looked upon the life he had known. He looked at the soft rooms, the carved pillars, the silks, the lamps, the sleeping comfort all around him. He looked at Leora and their child and felt the tenderness of love mixed with the ache of what he now understood. He was not leaving because he loved them too little. He was leaving because the question in his heart had become too true to ignore. If there was a way to meet suffering without being destroyed by it, if there was a peace deeper than pleasure, if there was a wisdom that could help all people face aging, sickness, and death with clarity and compassion, then he had to find it. So in the quiet hours before morning, Prince Anik left the palace behind, not in bitterness, not in failure, not in rejection of life, but in devotion to understanding it. He stepped away from comfort, not because comfort is wrong, but because comfort alone could not answer the deepest questions of the human heart. And with that single decision, the sheltered prince began to disappear, and the seeker was born. After leaving the palace, Prince Anik did not wander aimlessly. He gave himself fully to the search. If there was a way beyond fear, beyond clinging, beyond the suffering that shadows every human life, he meant to find it. For years he traveled across the land, seeking out the wisest teachers he could find. He listened with sincerity. He practiced with discipline. He learned methods of concentration so deep that the ordinary world seemed to fall away for hours at a time. His mind grew sharp. His will became strong. Yet each state of calm eventually passed. And when it passed, the old question remained. The suffering of life had not been solved. It had only been set aside for a little while. That was not enough. He was not looking for temporary escape. He was searching for something more lasting, something true, enough to remain, even when life became painful again. So Prince Anik turned toward a harsher path. If comfort had not brought freedom, perhaps hardship would. If luxury had softened the mind, perhaps severe discipline would purify it. He began to practice with an intensity that frightened those around him. He ate almost nothing. He denied himself rest. He pushed his body further and further, believing that peace might reveal itself through total conquest of the flesh. In time, his frame grew thin and fragile. His face hollowed. His skin clung to bone. His eyes sank back into the quiet suffering of exhaustion. He had left behind one extreme only to discover that he had entered another. For 6 long years, he lived this way. 6 years of effort. 6 years of stripping life down to almost nothing. 6 years of testing the limits of endurance. And yet, in all that time, he did not find the freedom he sought. What he found instead was a painful truth. A weakened body does not make a liberated mind. Starvation does not produce wisdom simply because it is severe. Suffering, when chosen blindly, is still suffering. And when the body is driven too far into depletion, the mind does not become clearer. It becomes clouded, strained, and dim. One day, standing at the edge of his own strength, Prince Anik saw with unmistakable clarity that this path was not leading where he had hoped. Luxury had not awakened him. Punishment would not awaken him either. This realization was not dramatic in the way people often imagine revelation. It did not arrive with thunder or spectacle. It arrived quietly, like a truth that had been waiting patiently for him to become still enough to hear it. Peace, he began to understand, does not live in extremes. It does not bloom in endless indulgence, and it does not bloom in merciless deprivation. It asks for something subtler, something steadier, a way of living that is neither grasping nor self-crushing, a way of balance, a middle path. Later, this understanding would become one of the great foundations of his teaching. But in that moment, it was simply a deeply human discovery. If you pull a string too tight, it snaps. If you leave it too loose, it cannot sing. Harmony lives somewhere in between. This wisdom reaches gently into modern life as well. Many people still move between the same two extremes. We chase pleasure, achievement, praise, distraction, and comfort, hoping that enough of them will finally quiet the heart. Then, disappointed by how quickly satisfaction fades, we swing in the opposite direction. We become harsh with ourselves. We try stricter routines, harder, discipline, more pressure, more control. We deny our own needs and call it strength. But the mind is rarely healed by either endless indulgence or relentless force. Prince Anik was beginning to see what so many of us must eventually learn for ourselves. Peace is not found by swinging harder between opposites. It is found by stepping out of the swing entirely. As this new understanding deepened, another memory rose within him, simple and strangely luminous. He remembered a day from childhood, long before the palace had become unbearable, and long before spiritual ambition had hardened into struggle. During a festival, he had once sat quietly beneath a rose-apple tree. No one had instructed him. No teacher had guided him. He had simply been there breathing, watching, resting in an effortless kind of ease. There had been no striving in that moment, no war against the body, no desperate reaching for enlightenment. And yet the peace he had touched then had been real, natural, and pure. Remembering this, Prince Anik began to wonder whether the truth he sought had never been hidden behind complexity at all. Perhaps it had always been closest when he stopped trying to force it into appearing. That memory changed the direction of his heart. He decided he would no longer follow methods simply because others praised them. He would stop measuring truth by severity. He would trust the quiet intelligence that had begun to awaken within him. And so, instead of continuing down the road of harsh denial, he allowed himself to receive what he needed. Near a river beneath the broad shelter of a great fig tree, a kind woman approached and offered him a bowl of rice milk. In earlier days of his severe practice, he might have rejected it in the name of purity. Now he understood differently. To receive nourishment was not weakness. To care for the body was not failure. If the mind was to see clearly, it needed steadiness, not collapse. So he accepted the offering without guilt, and little by little strength returned to him. There is something deeply tender in this moment. Before great awakening came a bowl of food. Before profound insight came the humility to stop wounding himself. Before the world knew him as a teacher, he first had to become honest enough to abandon what was not working. This too is part of wisdom. Not merely enduring, but discerning. Not merely trying harder, but seeing more clearly. Sometimes the bravest step on a spiritual path is not another act of effort, but the quiet surrender of a false path. When his strength had begun to return, Prince Anik sat down beneath that great tree by the river, the tree that would later be remembered as the tree of awakening. He settled himself upon the earth and made a vow with complete sincerity. He would not rise from that place until he had found the answer he had sought for so long. Not an answer borrowed from a teacher, and not a passing state of calm, but a truth deep enough to meet suffering at its root. The night was approaching. The river moved quietly nearby. The world held its breath. And beneath the branches of that silent tree, the long search was about to enter its deepest turning. The night gathered slowly around the great tree, and Prince Anik remained seated upon the earth with a steadiness that had not yet existed in him before. He was no longer trying to force peace to appear. He was no longer fighting his body, no longer chasing teachings simply because they sounded impressive, and no longer searching for some dramatic experience that would lift him out of human life. Instead, he sat very still and began to observe his own mind with complete honesty. He watched thoughts arise and fade. He noticed desires moving through him, asking for life to be different from what it was. He noticed fear reaching into the future. He noticed regret turning back toward what had already passed. He noticed how quickly the mind tried to cling, avoid, compare, imagine, resist. And as he watched all of this, without turning away, something extraordinary began to reveal itself. He saw that much of suffering was not created only by the world outside, but by the mind's constant struggle with what the world happened to be. He saw that peace did not depend on getting everything one wanted. It depended on seeing, wanting clearly, and no longer becoming its servant. Through the long hours of that night, insight opened within him again and again. He began to understand that pain is part of life, but the mind often adds a second layer to pain, a layer made of fear, resistance, and restless storytelling. A difficult moment arises, and then thought arrives to say this should not be happening. This will never end. Why is this happening to me? What if it becomes worse? What does this mean about my future, my worth, my safety. In this way, a single moment of discomfort becomes a long chain of suffering. Prince Anik saw this directly, not as theory, but as living truth. The mind creates its own weather and then trembles beneath the storm it has helped to build. Yet he also saw something equally important. When a thought was allowed to come and go without being grasped, when desire was seen without immediately obeying it, when fear was recognized without being fed, a natural stillness began to return. Peace was not something added from outside. It was what remained when the agitation softened. This is why the awakening beneath the tree matters so deeply. It was not the discovery of a strange or distant truth available only to saints. It was the clear seeing of something profoundly human. Prince Anik realized that the suffering of the heart grows wherever there is clinging. We cling to pleasure and fear its passing. We cling to identity and fear change. We cling to certainty in a world that has never promised certainty. We cling to life as if it could be frozen, and then we call it unfair when life continues to move. But the more tightly the mind closes around experience, the more pain it creates for itself. Freedom begins when that grip softens. Not because life suddenly becomes easy, but because the war against life begins to end. As dawn approached, the long search that had begun in the palace came to its resting place. When the first light of morning touched the horizon, Prince Anik was no longer the man who had sat down beneath the tree. He had awakened from the old illusion that lasting happiness could be secured through comfort, achievement, control, or possession. He had seen through the dream that peace lives somewhere outside us, waiting to be acquired like another treasure. From that morning onward, he became known as the Buddha, the Awakened One, not because he had become superhuman, but because he had fully awakened to the nature of the human mind and the freedom hidden within clear seeing. He had discovered that beneath all the agitation, beneath all the grasping and fear, there is a peace already present, quiet and steady, waiting like clear water beneath the mud. And perhaps this ancient story feels closer to your own life than it first appears. The patterns that troubled human beings 25 centuries ago are still with us now. We still tell ourselves that the next success will finally make us feel secure. We still imagine that the right relationship, the right purchase, the right version of ourselves, the right future arrangement will at last bring rest. We still replay the past long after it has ended. We still suffer over events that have not yet happened and may never happen at all. A deadline becomes heavier because the mind fills it with fear of failure. A difficult conversation becomes more painful because the imagination adds rejection, shame, and catastrophe before a single word is spoken. A storm outside becomes a storm inside because thought rushes ahead to everything that might go wrong. This is why the Buddha's insight remains so alive. He did not merely describe suffering, he located its mechanism. And because he located its mechanism, he also revealed that it can be softened. There is a simple image that helps make this clear. When water is muddy, you do not make it clear by striking it or forcing it to settle faster. You simply stop stirring it. In time, the mud falls away on its own, and the water remembers its natural clarity. The mind is often the same. Constant worry, endless wanting resistance to what is. These are the movements that keep the water clouded. When we begin to sit quietly, to observe gently, to stop feeding every thought, something in us begins to settle by its own intelligence. This is why even now, as you listen to these words, you are already touching the edge of what the Buddha discovered beneath that tree. You are pausing. You are listening. You are letting the mind rest, even if only a little from its usual habit of rushing forward or falling back. This is not a path away from life. It is a path deeper into life, into the peace that has always existed beneath the noise. In the years that followed, these insights began to spread from teacher to student, from village to village, from one culture to another. Over time, they moved across India and through Asia, adapting their language, but carrying the same quiet heart. When Buddhism entered China, it met the earthy wisdom of Taoism, and from that meeting, a beautifully direct form of practice began to blossom what we now call Zen. Zen did not abandon the Buddha's discovery. It distilled it. It learned to point toward truth with extraordinary simplicity, often through a brief exchange, a small story, a surprising answer that bypassed argument and went directly to the deeper mind. And because the deepest truths are not always best carried by explanation alone, it is through one of those simple Zen stories that our path now continues as the night grows softer and the mind becomes more willing to listen without strain. 0 seconds / greater than it is through one of those simple Zen stories that the path now continues, not by asking the mind to think harder, but by inviting it to relax its usual habit of reaching for answers in the distance. There once lived a Zen master, whom we will call Master Ren, known for teaching in a way that was both gentle and disarming. He did not always respond with long explanations. He understood that the deepest truths can be missed when the mind becomes too busy trying to capture them. So he often used a few words, or even a single word, to point beyond thought and back toward direct seeing. One day, a sincere student came to him with a question that sounded simple on the surface. Master, the student asked, "Does a dog have Buddha nature? Does even such a simple creature carry the potential for awakening?" Master Ren looked at him with calm, kind eyes and answered with just one word: Mu. In this telling, we may hear it as no or nothing, or perhaps not the question you think it is. At first, this answer can seem puzzling, even disappointing. Buddhist teaching usually affirms that all beings carry the seed of awakening. So why would a Zen master answer in this way? But Master Ren was not really giving a lesson about dogs. He was pointing to something far closer and more immediate. The student's question, though sincere, still carried the old habit of searching for truth, as if it were an object to be examined from outside. It is the same movement the mind makes when it asks, "Am I spiritual enough? Will I ever find peace? Is awakening something I possess, or something I lack?" These questions sound thoughtful, but they often keep us circling around ourselves. They treat peace as if it were somewhere else, something to be reached later, something granted only when enough conditions have been met. Master Ren's answer cut through all of that in a single breath. Mu was like a soft hand sweeping away the furniture of the mind, clearing the room so the student might notice what was already here. In that sense, the answer was not cold at all. It was compassionate. It was an invitation to stop searching outside the present moment for what can only be recognized within it. Right now, as you listen to these words, there is nothing you need to add to this moment in order to be here. No special state is required for awareness to exist. No certificate of worthiness is needed for breath to rise and fall. No future version of yourself must arrive before this moment can be complete. And yet the mind so often acts as though completeness is always elsewhere. We tell ourselves that peace will come when the anxiety is gone, when the work is finished, when the relationship is fixed, when the body feels better, when the future becomes certain, when we become somehow more deserving of rest. But the deeper irony is that this very habit of postponing peace keeps the heart from touching the little bit of peace already available now. Master Ren's single word points back to that truth. Stop reaching quite so hard. Notice what remains when the reaching softens. This is why the old Zen stories feel so alive. They do not merely give information. They reveal the habits of the mind by interrupting them. The student expected an answer that would satisfy thought. Instead, he received something that unsettled thought. And in that unsettling, a door opened. We may think we want answers, but often what we really need is release from the way we keep framing the question. We are not empty because some essential piece is missing. More often, we feel empty because the mind has learned to overlook the quiet wholeness of simple awareness. We have turned life into a long search for completion, not realizing that much of our exhaustion comes from the searching itself. From here, the path opens naturally into what the Buddha later described as the Four Noble Truths. These are not dogmas to be memorized, and they are not heavy religious commands. They are more like the diagnosis and medicine of a wise physician offered to anyone who has ever felt restless, burdened, afraid, disappointed, lonely, or unable to sleep because the mind keeps insisting that something is missing. The first noble truth is beautifully plain. Life contains suffering. This may sound severe at first, but it is not a gloomy statement. It is simply honest. Bodies age, people become ill, loved ones part from us, plans fall apart. We do not always get what we want, and sometimes we receive exactly what we did not want. Even in happy seasons, there can be a quiet unease beneath the surface, a tension made of knowing that everything changes. The Buddha was not saying that life is only suffering. He was saying that suffering is woven into human life, and peace begins not when we deny this, but when we stop pretending it should be otherwise. There is great kindness in this truth. So much of our exhaustion comes from arguing with reality. We lie awake, trying to secure a future that cannot be guaranteed. We spend long hours resisting the fact that uncertainty is part of being alive. We ask why life is not smoother, fairer, easier, more obedient to our preferences. But when we stop expecting life to be free of difficulty, something surprisingly gentle begins to happen. We do not become hopeless. We become less shocked by reality. We stop wasting so much energy demanding that rain behave like sunlight. We begin, little by little, to learn how to live under changing skies. This first truth does not close the heart. It opens it. It says, you are not failing because life is sometimes painful. You are not broken because worry has visited you, or grief has passed through you, or fear has sat beside your bed at night. These things are part of the shared human condition. To acknowledge them is not weakness. It is the beginning of freedom. And once that freedom begins, even quietly, the next truth can be heard more clearly. The truth that most of our deepest suffering comes not only from what happens, but from the mind's struggle with what happens. That is where our path now turns next, as the night continues to soften around us. And so the path turns gently from the simple honesty of the first noble truth into the second, which reveals where so much of our suffering actually comes from. This is the part that surprises many people. The Buddha did not say that our deepest pain is caused only by the outer events of life. He saw that while life certainly brings difficulty, much of the suffering that exhausts us is created by the mind's reaction to difficulty. In Buddhist language, this is often called craving or attachment, though those words can sound narrower than what is really meant. It is that restless movement in the mind that keeps insisting things should be different from how they are. It is the subtle tension of wanting the weather to change, wanting the body to feel different, wanting people to behave according to our expectations, wanting the future to become safe before it has even arrived. It is the mind replaying what has already ended, rewriting old conversations, rehearsing tomorrow's worries, resisting what is already here. This constant inner motion is what keeps the heart from resting, even when nothing truly urgent is happening in the present moment. You can feel this in ordinary life almost everywhere. A delay becomes more than a delay because the mind says this should not be happening. A disappointment becomes more than a disappointment because thought begins building a whole identity around it. Someone speaks to us carelessly in the morning, and the words follow us into the afternoon, then into the evening, gathering more emotional force each time we revisit them. A future possibility appears, and before anything has happened at all, the mind has already written several frightening versions of what might unfold. In this way, the moment itself may be small, but our mental resistance enlarges it. The Buddha saw this with astonishing clarity. He understood that while we cannot remove all pain from life, we can begin to see how much extra suffering is being manufactured by the mind's refusal to let life move as it moves. There is an old story that illuminates this truth with unusual tenderness. Two monks were traveling together along a road after heavy rain. The earth was soft beneath their sandals, and the river ahead was running faster than usual. When they reached the bank, they saw a young woman standing there in distress, unable to cross the strong current alone. The older monk, without hesitation, stepped forward, lifted her gently in his arms, and carried her safely through the water to the other side. Then he set her down, bowed slightly, and continued on his way, as if nothing unusual had happened. The younger monk followed in silence, but inside himself, a storm had already begun. Their monastery's rules were strict. Physical contact with women was forbidden. He respected his elder deeply, yet his thoughts became tangled with confusion, judgment, and inner protest. For hours they walked beneath the shifting light of the afternoon, and still the younger monk carried the scene in his mind, turning it over, tightening around it, unable to release it. At last, unable to contain himself any longer, the younger monk spoke. "Master," he said, "our vows forbid us to touch women, yet you carried that woman across the river. How can such a thing be justified?" The older monk turned to him with a calm expression and answered with a gentleness that carried more teaching than any lecture. "My friend," he said, "I set that woman down at the riverbank hours ago. You have been carrying her ever since." In that single reply, the whole burden of the younger monk's suffering was revealed. The older monk had responded to the reality before him with compassion, then let the moment end when it ended. The younger monk, unable to release his resistance, had continued the event in his mind long after the river was behind them. He was no longer suffering because of the woman or the crossing. He was suffering because he kept carrying the moment inside himself. This is such a simple story, yet it reaches deeply into the structure of our own days. How often do we do exactly the same thing? A conversation ends, but inwardly we continue it. A mistake happens, but instead of allowing it to remain in the past, we drag it with us for hours, even years. A fear appears about tomorrow, and we carry it as though it were already happening. We collect these unfinished inner burdens like stones in a bag, then wonder why our hearts feel so tired. The suffering is often not in the original event alone. It is in the carrying. It is in the repetition. It is in the mind's inability to set something down after life has already moved on. This is the second noble truth made visible. We cling, resist, rehearse, and relive, and then we suffer beneath the weight of what we ourselves keep lifting back onto our shoulders. And yet this is not where the teaching leaves us. The Buddha did not point out the origin of suffering in order to make us feel trapped. He pointed it out because anything that is created can also begin to dissolve. This is the third noble truth, and it is filled with quiet hope. If suffering is intensified by grasping, resisting, and endless mental friction, then freedom begins when that friction softens. The Buddha called this freedom nirvana, a word that suggests extinguishing like a fire that has finally stopped burning through dry grass. What is extinguished is not your personality, not your warmth, not your love for life. What fades is the inner fire of constant wanting, rejecting, and struggling against reality. When that fire cools, even for a moment, something spacious appears. There is breath again. There is room again. There is a peace that does not need everything to be perfect before it can be felt. Some people hear this and worry that letting go will make them passive, dull, or detached from the world. But the opposite is closer to the truth. When you are no longer burning energy on mental resistance, you have more energy available for wise response. You can still care deeply. You can still work toward what matters. You can still love, build, protect, repair, and act. But you begin to hold your goals with a gentler hand. You become less desperate and more clear, like a skilled musician whose fingers are relaxed enough to move with precision, or an athlete so absorbed in the living moment of action that tension no longer blocks the body's intelligence. You begin to discover that peace is not the enemy of effectiveness. Peace actually makes wise action possible. And this naturally leads us toward the fourth noble truth, the practical path by which freedom is lived, not just admired. It is here that the teachings stop being ideas and become a way of walking through ordinary life. It is here that mindfulness begins to offer us something immediate, simple, and profoundly real. The fourth noble truth does not offer a miracle, and it does not promise that life will suddenly become smooth or predictable. Instead, it offers a path, a way of living that gently retrains the mind and softens the heart. The Buddha called it the Eightfold Path. But it is not necessary to memorize its parts tonight. What matters is the spirit of it. It is a path of wise understanding, wise intention, wise speech, wise, action-wise, livelihood, wise effort, wise mindfulness, and wise concentration. In simpler language, it is a life lived with awareness instead of habit, with compassion instead of reactivity, with steadiness instead of constant grasping. At the center of this path lies something very quiet and very powerful: mindfulness. Not as a trend, not as a performance, not as a way to appear calm, but as a direct and honest relationship with the present moment. Mindfulness means noticing what is happening while it is happening. It means feeling a breath as it enters the body and leaves again. It means recognizing a thought as a thought, rather than as a command that must be obeyed. It means sensing an emotion rising without immediately building a story around it. This sounds simple, and in a way, it is. Yet it changes everything, because most suffering grows strongest when we are no longer aware that we are feeding it. Think of how quickly the mind can move. A single sensation appears in the body, perhaps a tightness in the chest, and before we have noticed it clearly, the mind has already begun labeling it. Is something wrong? Am I in danger? What if this gets worse? Then memory arrives. Then imagination arrives. Then comparison arrives. And suddenly, we are no longer with the original sensation at all. We are inside a narrative. We are living in a future that has not happened, or a past that cannot be changed. Mindfulness gently interrupts that chain. It brings attention back to what is actually here. This breath, this sound, this sensation, this moment. Not as a theory, but as a living experience. Many people assume meditation means stopping thoughts entirely. But that is not what the Buddha discovered beneath the tree. Thoughts may continue to arise. Emotions may continue to move through the body. The difference is in our relationship to them. Instead of chasing each thought, we begin to watch it. Instead of fighting each emotion, we begin to allow it. Instead of tightening around discomfort, we begin to breathe with it. In doing so, we are no longer adding that second layer of suffering. We are no longer carrying the woman across the river hours after she has already stepped onto dry land. There is a small image that captures this shift. Imagine the mind as a clear sky and thoughts as passing clouds. When we are lost in thought, we feel as though we are the cloud itself, tossed and reshaped by every movement of wind. But when mindfulness grows, we begin to recognize that we are more like the sky. Clouds come, clouds go. Some are dark and heavy. Some are light and bright. Yet the sky itself remains open, unchanged by the particular shape of any single cloud. This does not mean we stop caring about life. It means we stop mistaking every passing mental event for our entire identity. And this understanding becomes deeply practical when we return to the ordinary details of our own days. Washing dishes can be an act of rushing toward the next task, or it can be an act of feeling warm water on the hands, noticing the rhythm of movement, hearing the soft sound of ceramic touching ceramic. Walking from one room to another can be a blur of thinking, or it can be a quiet awareness of the feet meeting the floor. Even lying in bed at night, unable to sleep, can shift from frustration into a gentle observation of breath rising and falling. Nothing dramatic has changed in the outer world, yet the quality of inner experience has transformed. This is how the path begins to weave itself into life. not through grand gestures, but through small returns. Return to the breath, return to the body, return to what is here, again and again. Each return is a soft laying down of what you do not need to carry. Each return is a reminder that peace is not found in controlling every outcome, but in learning how to be present for whatever unfolds. And as this practice deepens, another question naturally arises. If mindfulness allows us to see suffering clearly, and if letting go softens its grip, how do we relate to the pain of others? How do we open the heart without becoming overwhelmed? The path does not end with calm awareness. It continues into compassion, into the training of the heart itself. And it is there that our journey now gently moves as the night grows quieter and the mind grows more spacious. As the path continues, it becomes clear that mindfulness, though powerful, is not the whole of the journey. Awareness helps us see what is happening inside us. It teaches us to notice thoughts without being swallowed by them, to feel emotions without immediately turning them into stories, and to return again and again to the simple steadiness of the present moment. But once we begin to see our inner life more clearly, another question naturally arises. How do we relate to what we see? If we notice fear, do we punish ourselves for being afraid? If we notice anger, do we harden against it? If we notice sadness, do we treat it as a flaw that must be corrected as quickly as possible? This is where the training of the heart becomes essential, because clear seeing without kindness can become dry, and awareness without compassion can sometimes leave a person feeling even more alone. The Buddha understood this deeply, which is why mindfulness is so often paired with loving kindness. The gentle practice of meeting life, ourselves and others, with warmth instead of hostility, with tenderness instead of inner violence. Loving kindness, sometimes called metta, is not sentimental and it is not weak. It does not mean pretending that everything is fine, and it does not ask us to approve of harmful behavior. It is something quieter and stronger than that. It is the deliberate cultivation of goodwill, the steady wish that beings, including ourselves, may be safe, peaceful, healthy, and free from unnecessary suffering. This may sound simple, almost too simple for the complicated lives people live. But in truth, many hearts have become exhausted, precisely because they have forgotten how to offer this kind of gentleness. We have learned how to criticize ourselves, how to compare, how to brace, how to defend, how to expect disappointment before it arrives. We have become skilled at tension. Loving kindness begins to teach us another skill, the skill of softening without collapsing, of remaining open without becoming naive, of responding with care rather than reflexive pain. The Buddha taught that hatred is never ended by hatred, but only by love. This is not a poetic exaggeration, it is practical psychology. When anger meets anger, the fire spreads. When resentment answers resentment, both hearts grow heavier. Even inwardly, this is true. When you are struggling and then begin attacking yourself for struggling, suffering multiplies. A difficult moment becomes a cruel one. But when awareness is joined by kindness, something begins to change. The same painful moment may still be painful, but it is no longer sharpened by self-rejection. There is more room around it, more breath, more patience, more possibility of healing. Loving kindness does not erase pain, but it changes the atmosphere in which pain is held. and that can change everything. This is especially important because many people find that the first person who is hardest to love is themselves. It is often easier to be generous with a friend than with our own frightened mind. Easier to comfort someone else than to place a hand over our own heart and admit with honesty that this is hard right now. Yet the practice traditionally begins there, not because the self should be worshipped, but because a heart at war with itself cannot easily become a refuge for anyone else. So the first movement of loving kindness is very humble. You sit quietly. You let the breath settle. You bring attention inward, not with harshness, but with care. And then gently, you offer yourself simple wishes. May I be peaceful. May I be safe. May I be kind to myself. May I be free from suffering. If those exact words feel unnatural, other words may be used. The phrases matter less than the sincerity behind them. What matters is the intention to stop speaking inwardly like an enemy and begin little by little to speak like a friend. At first, many people feel resistance here. A voice may arise and say, "This is silly," or "I do not deserve this," or "What is the point of repeating kind phrases when life remains difficult?" But this resistance is not a sign that the practice is failing. It is simply a sign that the heart has been neglected in this particular way for a long time. If someone has lived for years beneath self-criticism, then self-compassion can feel unfamiliar, even uncomfortable, like stepping into warm water after standing too long in the cold. The answer is not to force feeling where no feeling yet exists. The answer is to continue gently, like planting seeds in quiet soil. Not every seed blooms immediately, but something is being prepared beneath the surface. The intention itself already matters. Even the willingness to try is a form of kindness beginning to awaken. From there, the practice begins to widen. Once loving wishes have been offered to yourself, they may be extended to someone who is easy to love. Perhaps a child, a dear friend, a parent, a partner, or even a beloved animal. You bring that being gently to mind. You remember the warmth of their presence, the softness of affection, the uncomplicated wish that they be well. And then you offer the same blessings to them. May you be peaceful. May you be healthy. May you be safe. May you be free from suffering. For many people, this part feels natural. The heart recognizes itself here. It remembers that love is not something foreign that must be manufactured from nothing. It is already present, already alive, already waiting to be trusted and extended more widely. In time, the circle can widen further to include strangers, neighbors, those we barely notice, and eventually, those who trouble us. But that deeper work is not rushed. The path of loving kindness is not a performance in moral perfection. It is a gradual re-education of the heart. It teaches us to see that every being we pass is carrying something invisible, some private burden, some hope for relief, some longing to be free from pain. And when this understanding begins to settle into us, the world becomes less divided into allies and enemies, less organized around preference and aversion. We begin to feel, however faintly at first, that we are living among fellow travelers, each one seeking peace in their own imperfect way. And because these teachings are never meant to remain abstract for long, the path now turns very naturally toward a story. A story about a man whose heart had become heavy with betrayal and who discovered slowly and painfully that loving kindness was not about excusing what had happened to him. It was about no longer drinking poison in the hope that someone else would suffer from it. 0 seconds / greater than before loving kindness becomes something we can offer to the wider world. It often has to pass through the most wounded places in the heart. That is why the path now turns very naturally toward a story. Long ago, in a busy region of ancient India, there lived a merchant whom we will call Ravi. He traveled between villages, buying and selling goods to support his large family, and throughout the region, he was known as an honest man, careful in his dealings, and generous in spirit. But for all his fairness, he carried a heaviness that never seemed to leave him. Years earlier, his younger brother had borrowed a large sum of money from him to begin a business of his own, promising to repay it within a year. When that year passed, no repayment came. Then avoidance began. Then silence. At last, the brother disappeared into a distant village, leaving Ravi with the loss of his life savings and the deeper wound of betrayal by someone he had trusted completely. The money had mattered, of course, because its absence forced hardship upon his household. But what cut even deeper was the pain of being abandoned by love. For 3 long years, Ravi carried that hurt like a stone lodged in his chest, replaying the betrayal at night, imagining confrontations, rehearsing angry words he might one day speak, if fate ever placed his brother before him again. As time passed, the wound began to spread into places that had nothing to do with the original loss. This is so often the way with resentment. It never agrees to remain in one small corner of the heart. It stains whatever it touches. Ravi became suspicious of other people's motives. He grew harsher with his children when they made ordinary mistakes. Life itself began to seem unfair to him, as though the whole world had joined in his brother's betrayal. Even when nothing difficult was happening in the present moment, the bitterness remained active, quietly shaping the way he saw everything. This is one of the saddest features of unresolved hurt. It does not simply preserve pain. It recruits new pain. It makes fresh moments answer for old ones. And because the injury lived so vividly in Ravi's mind, he could not tell where the original betrayal ended, and his own continual reliving of it began. One day, while passing through a village he had never visited before, Ravi came upon an old monk seated peacefully beneath a banyan tree. There was something about the monk's stillness that made stopping feel natural. Ravi sat beside him, and before long, without quite intending to, he found himself pouring out the whole story. He spoke of the money, the disappearance, the shame, the anger, the sleepless nights, and the years of inner argument that had brought him no relief. The monk listened with a patience so complete that Ravi felt, perhaps for the first time in years, that he was not alone inside his suffering. When he had finished, the old monk remained quiet for a long moment, and then asked a question so simple that it seemed almost strange. "Who," he said gently, "is your anger really punishing?" Ravi was startled. To him, the answer had seemed obvious. His brother deserved his anger. His brother had earned it. But the monk continued with the tenderness of someone offering medicine rather than correction. "Your brother is somewhere far away living his life, but you carry this poison every day. You drink it hoping it will hurt him, yet it is your own heart that burns. Your anger has stolen years from your life, created distance between you and your children, and turned the land inside you barren. Is this the punishment you intended? The truth of those words struck Ravi more deeply than accusation ever could have. He saw, perhaps for the first time with complete clarity, that his resentment had not brought justice. It had only prolonged suffering. Still, he was not ready to pretend nothing had happened. "But how can I let go?" he asked. "How can I forgive what he did? Does he not need to face the consequences of his actions?" And here, the monk answered with a wisdom that opened the next stage of the journey. Forgiveness, he explained, does not mean approving of harm. It does not mean calling betrayal acceptable, nor does it mean abandoning discernment or boundaries. It means freeing yourself from the prison of resentment. The brother would meet the consequences of his choices through the natural unfolding of cause and effect. Ravi did not need to become judge, jailer, and executioner inside his own heart. He could choose freedom instead. Then the monk taught him a practice so gentle, it almost seemed too small for such a large wound. Each morning, he said, begin by offering loving wishes to yourself. May I be happy. May I be peaceful. May I be free from suffering. When that becomes a little more natural, extend the same wishes to your wife and children, then slowly to friends, neighbors, and strangers. And only when you are ready, perhaps after weeks, perhaps after months, include your brother as well. Ravi was skeptical. It seemed almost impossible that a few quiet phrases could touch a wound that had shaped his life for years. And yet something in the monk's presence made him willing to try. So he began. At first, even wishing himself peace felt awkward. He discovered how harsh his inner voice had become, how little kindness he offered himself for his own struggles, disappointments, and exhaustion. But he continued day after day, like someone carrying water to dry ground. Gradually, the knot of anger in his chest began to loosen. Offering loving wishes to his family came more easily, and almost immediately he noticed that something in the atmosphere of his home had changed. His children approached him with less fear. His wife, who had silently borne the bitterness that had settled over the household, began to smile more often. The wound was still there, but it no longer ruled every room he entered. Months later, when he finally felt ready to include his brother in the practice, he could barely manage a few words. Even so, those few words opened a door. Beneath the anger, he discovered grief. Beneath the grief, he discovered love, not entirely extinguished. And beneath that, the first real taste of release. About a year after meeting the monk, word reached Ravi that his brother had been asking about him and wished to make amends. When they finally met again, Ravi was surprised by what he found in himself. The blazing anger he had imagined carrying into that meeting was gone. In its place, there was sadness for the years that had been lost, tenderness for the pain both of them had lived through, and gratitude that reconciliation was still possible. His brother, overcome with tears, confessed that guilt and shame had kept him away all that time. He had wanted to return, wanted to make things right, but had not known how to face what he had done. In time, the money was repaid, but Ravi understood that the true restoration had happened long before the debt was settled. The greatest gift was not the return of his savings, it was the return of his peace. Loving kindness had not turned him into a doormat, and it had not erased the wrong. It had simply freed him from carrying the wrong inside his own body for the rest of his life. This is why the practice matters so much. It is not naive. It is not passive. It is not a demand to feel warm emotions on command. It is a way of refusing to let pain harden into identity. It is a way of saying that what happened to you may have been real, but it does not have to become the permanent climate of your heart. And once that becomes even a little bit visible, the next step on the path becomes clear. Loving kindness must now move from story into practice, from understanding into direct experience, beginning where the monk told Ravi to begin with the quiet and often difficult work of offering gentleness to yourself. And so the practice moves inward again, not as an idea to admire, but as something quiet and living that can be felt in the body and repeated with the breath. After a story like Ravi's, it can be tempting to rush ahead to the dramatic part, to the moment when the heart finally opens toward the one who caused pain. But the path of loving kindness is gentler than that. It begins where the heart is most tender and most in need of care. It begins with yourself. In the original teaching, this is described as the hardest step for many people, especially those who have spent years speaking to themselves with criticism, disappointment, or silent shame. The instruction is beautifully simple. Find a comfortable position. Let the breath settle naturally. Place a hand over the heart if that feels soothing. Then begin offering yourself a few quiet wishes, not as commands, but as blessings. May I be happy. May I be healthy. May I be at peace. May I be free from suffering. If those exact words feel too formal, other words may be used. May I be kind to myself. May I feel safe. May I rest in peace. The form matters less than the sincerity. What matters is the turning of the heart toward itself with gentleness rather than judgment. At first, this can feel strangely awkward. A skeptical voice may rise almost immediately. This is silly. This will not help. I do not deserve these words. Nothing has changed just because I repeated a few phrases in the dark. But this resistance is not a sign to stop. It is part of the practice itself. The script makes this point very clearly. Many of us have spent years becoming our own harshest critics. So self-compassion naturally feels unfamiliar in the beginning. The answer is not to fight the resistance or try to manufacture a warm emotion on demand. The answer is simply to continue with patient intention, like planting seeds in the garden of the heart, and trusting that roots may be growing even before anything visible has appeared above the soil. Loving kindness is not about forcing a feeling. It is about offering a direction. It is the repeated choice to stop abandoning yourself inwardly, even if tenderness still feels distant at first. This is why the practice can be so quietly transformative. The mind that has spent years bracing itself begins little by little to loosen. The body that has grown used to carrying inner hardness starts to recognize another possibility. You may not notice a dramatic shift the first time you repeat the phrases or even the 10th, but over time, something subtle begins to change. The inner voice becomes less cruel. The breath begins to move more freely. You catch yourself in a painful moment, and instead of adding blame, you offer companionship. This is a moment of suffering. This is hard right now. May I be kind to myself in this moment? In this way, loving kindness becomes more than a formal meditation. It becomes a new way of being with your own life. And once this begins to feel even a little more natural, the circle widens. The next step is to bring to mind someone you love easily and without complication. Perhaps a child, a dear friend, a grandparent, a partner, or even a beloved animal. The original script suggests picturing them as clearly as possible, seeing their face, remembering their smile, feeling the warmth of your connection. Then you offer them the same wishes you have begun to offer yourself. May you be happy. May you be healthy. May you be at peace. May you be free from suffering. For many people, this part flows more naturally. The heart seems to recognize its own language here. Love does not need to be invented from nothing. It is already present. The practice simply teaches us how to rest inside it consciously and how to let it move outward with intention, rather than remaining hidden as a private feeling. There is something deeply healing in this widening. When we hold a loved one gently in awareness and offer them blessings, we begin to feel that love is not a scarce resource that must be protected or rationed. It is more like warmth from a lamp. The more steadily it burns, the more naturally it fills the room. And in many cases, as Ravi discovered in the story before, this loving wishes extended to those closest to us begin to change the atmosphere around us almost immediately. When the heart softens, relationships soften. When warmth returns inwardly, it begins to be felt outwardly too. People sense it, even if no word is spoken. The original script notes that as loving wishes were extended to family children, approached more freely, and the home itself seemed lighter. This is one of the quiet miracles of the practice. We think we are only changing our private inner world, but the inner world always spills into the spaces where we live and love. So if you are listening tonight and wondering whether such a small practice can truly matter, it may help to remember that the heart is shaped by repetition. It is shaped by what it hears often. If it has heard condemnation for years, then condemnation begins to feel normal. If it begins little by little to hear kindness instead, then kindness too can become believable. This is how loving kindness grows. Not through force, not through performance, through repetition, sincerity, and patience. First with yourself, then with someone you love. Then, as the path continues, with those who stand a little farther away, the neighbors, the strangers, the people whose lives brush against yours without ever fully entering your story. And beyond them, eventually, even those who are difficult. But that wider circle comes next. For now, it is enough to rest in this simple beginning, where the heart learns again how to bless rather than withhold, how to soften rather than brace, and how to trust that even a quiet wish repeated faithfully can begin to change a life. And once the heart has learned, even in a small way, how to offer kindness to itself and to those it already loves, the circle widens again. This widening is important because love that remains only within the borders of preference is still a limited love. So the practice next turns toward those we do not know well, the ordinary people who move quietly through the edges of our days. A cashier whose face we barely remember, a neighbor we greet but never truly know. Someone who passed us on the street this morning and disappeared into the flow of the city. These are what the old teachings call neutral people, not because their lives are insignificant, but because our hearts have not yet formed a strong attachment or aversion toward them. To bring such a person gently to mind and offer them loving wishes is to begin dissolving the invisible wall between my life and other lives. It is a quiet recognition that strangers too long for peace, safety, and relief from suffering just as we do. This stage of the practice may seem simple, but it changes the texture of the world in subtle ways. The mind that is used to moving through crowds half asleep begins to remember that every face contains an inner life. Every passerby carries worries. You cannot see memories. You will never know hopes that matter as much to them as yours matter to you. The heart becomes less narrow, less occupied only with its own circle of concern. And as this awareness deepens, something softens in the way you inhabit the day. You become less alone inside yourself because the world begins to feel less like a collection of obstacles and more like a field of fellow travelers, each one trying in their own imperfect way to make it through the burden and beauty of being human. Only after this widening does the practice move toward one of its most transformative and most challenging steps, including difficult people. The teaching here is very wise and very gentle. It does not tell you to begin with the deepest wound of your life. It does not demand that you immediately summon warm affection for someone who has caused serious harm. Instead, it suggests starting smaller with someone who creates irritation rather than devastation. A colleague who interrupts too often. A neighbor whose dog barks too early in the morning. A supervisor whose criticism has a sharp edge to it. These are often the people who give us the first real opportunity to discover whether loving kindness is merely a beautiful idea or something we are actually willing to practice when discomfort appears. The point is not to pretend their behavior is pleasant. The point is to see more deeply into it. Difficult behavior nearly always grows out of suffering, confusion, insecurity, fear, or inner pressure. This does not make the behavior acceptable, and it does not require you to become passive or exposed to further harm. But it does invite you to see that the person troubling you is not a monster standing outside the human condition. They too are caught in it. They too are struggling however poorly. And when you offer even the smallest sincere wish for their well-being, something important happens inside your own heart. The poison of resentment begins to lose its grip. Sometimes, the most honest beginning is very modest. May this person be free from the pain that causes them to hurt others. Or even may this person be safe and far away from me. The teaching allows for that too. Any genuine movement away from hatred and toward humanity plants a seed of freedom. There is a story that brings this truth into modern life with remarkable clarity. In a busy office in Tokyo, there worked a young woman whom we will call Aiko. Each morning she entered the building with a tightening in her stomach because of her supervisor, Mr. Sato. He was demanding, critical, and almost never satisfied with anyone's work. He embarrassed employees publicly over minor mistakes and had a way of speaking that made people feel smaller the longer they stood near him. Aiko began losing sleep. Headaches became common. Anxiety settled into her body so deeply that even evenings at home no longer felt restful. At last, desperate for some kind of relief, she came across an article about loving kindness meditation. She doubted that such a simple practice could make any difference, but exhaustion made her willing to try. So she followed the instructions. First, she offered loving wishes to herself, then to her family, and only gradually, with great reluctance, did she begin including Mr. Sato in the practice. as well. The first time she tried the words barely came out. To whisper, "May you be happy," toward the man who had filled so many of her days with dread, felt almost impossible. Anger rose immediately. Resistance rose with it. But she stayed with the practice night after night, not because she suddenly liked him, but because she could feel how resentment was exhausting her. Slowly, the hard knot in her chest began to soften. Nothing outward had changed yet, but something inward had. Then, after several weeks during a tense meeting in which Mr. Sato was berating another employee, Aiko found herself looking at him differently for the first time. She noticed the strain in his shoulders, the dark circles under his eyes, the tightness in his jaw, and suddenly she saw not simply a cruel man, but a suffering human being, someone driven by his own pain and insecurity. This did not excuse his behavior, but it released her from the habit of taking every harsh word as a personal wound. From that point on, Aiko began responding differently. When criticism came, she answered with calm professionalism rather than defensive anger. When Mr. Sato was especially severe, she sometimes offered a silent, loving wish instead of inwardly hardening. Over time, the energy between them changed. He began giving her more substantial assignments. On occasion, he even thanked her for her work. Later, she learned that he had been living through a painful divorce while also caring for his sick mother. These circumstances did not justify the way he treated others, but they helped explain the pressure under which he had been living. And with that understanding came one of the great lessons of loving kindness. Many people who behave badly are suffering badly. We are not required to approve of their conduct, but we can choose not to let their pain turn into poison inside us. We can respond from steadiness rather than reactivity, from wisdom rather than reflexive hurt. This is where the practice becomes very real. It is no longer only a meditation done in stillness before sleep. It becomes something carried into offices, meetings, traffic, family, tension, and all the ordinary frictions of life. Yet an important question remains, and it must be answered carefully. If loving kindness opens the heart, how do we keep that openness from becoming self-erasure? How do we remain compassionate without allowing harmful behavior to continue unchecked? The path does not ignore this question. In fact, it leads directly into it, because true compassion is never the same as weakness, and an open heart still needs wise boundaries. And so the teaching becomes even more balanced, even more human, because an open heart must also be a wise heart. Loving kindness is not the same as surrendering your discernment. Compassion is not the same as allowing harm to continue without response. In fact, when the Buddha spoke of kindness, he never meant a softness that collapses into passivity. He meant a strength that does not need hatred in order to be clear. This matters deeply because many people hear about forgiveness, compassion, or loving kindness, and immediately fear that these teachings ask them to become defenseless, silent, or endlessly accommodating. But true compassion does not require you to disappear. It does not ask you to confuse goodness with self-abandonment. It does not ask you to smile while being wounded. What it offers instead is a way of protecting peace without hardening the heart, a way of drawing boundaries without turning these boundaries into walls of bitterness. This is why loving kindness must mature into wisdom. If the heart opens without clarity, it can become entangled. If clarity acts without kindness, it can become cold. The path asks for both. It asks us to see suffering clearly, including the suffering that causes people to act badly, and at the same time to recognize that understanding someone's pain does not mean giving them unlimited access to our life. You may feel compassion for a person and still choose distance. You may wish them peace and still say no. You may understand their wound and still refuse to let that wound keep spilling into your home, your body, your work, or your spirit. This is not a failure of love. It is love guided by wisdom. It is what allows compassion to remain real, steady, and clean, rather than becoming confused with guilt or obligation. Imagine a doctor treating a patient with a contagious illness. The doctor may care deeply, may speak gently, may work tirelessly for the patient's recovery, but care does not mean abandoning all protection. Gloves are worn, boundaries are observed. Necessary distance is kept where it must be kept. This does not reduce compassion. It makes effective compassion possible. In much the same way, when we meet difficult people, in ordinary life, the kindest response is not always closeness. Sometimes kindness takes the form of a calm boundary, a clear limit, a refusal to participate in cycles of harm. The heart remains open, but the doorway is no longer unguarded. This is especially important because many gentle people have spent years misunderstanding compassion. They have believed that being good means absorbing more than they should, tolerating what should not be tolerated, and calling their own exhaustion love. But exhaustion is not the same as kindness. Silence in the face of repeated harm is not the same as wisdom. And allowing resentment to build simply because one is afraid to set a boundary does not create peace. It creates a hidden war inside the heart. The teachings offer another way. Speak truthfully, but without cruelty. Step back when necessary, but without hatred. Protect your inner life, not as an act of selfishness, but as an act of stewardship. A peaceful heart is not a luxury. It is something sacred enough to care for. In this sense, boundaries can themselves be a form of compassion. They are compassionate toward yourself because they prevent needless suffering from accumulating. They can also be compassionate toward others because when limits are clear, people are more likely to meet reality as it is, rather than continue acting from unconscious habit. A boundary says, in effect, I will not hate you, but I will not join you in this harm. I do not need to punish you to protect myself. I do not need to become cruel in order to become clear. This is a profoundly liberating discovery. It means that peace does not require either aggression or submission. There is a middle way here too, just as there was for Prince Anik beneath the tree. Not indulgence, not self-crushing, not bitterness, not collapse. A steady, grounded, open-eyed response. And perhaps this is one of the reasons these teachings remain so alive. They do not ask us to become less human. They ask us to become more honest about what a loving human life actually requires. Sometimes it requires tenderness. Sometimes it requires distance. Sometimes it requires silent understanding. Sometimes it requires a difficult conversation spoken with a calm voice. Sometimes it requires walking away without hatred. In each case, the outer form may differ, but the inner question remains the same. Can I respond without feeding the fire? Can I protect what matters without turning hard? Can I remain rooted in dignity, in clarity, and in peace? When this kind of compassion begins to take shape, the heart becomes stronger, not weaker. It no longer mistakes intensity for love. It no longer thinks suffering must be welcomed in order to prove goodness. It begins to understand that gentleness and strength belong together, and from that stronger heart, we become more ready to meet one of the deepest teachings of all the teaching, that everything we love, everything we fear, everything we try so hard to hold exists within the changing stream of impermanence. Loving kindness softens the heart. Wise boundaries steady it. And now, with that steadiness, the path turns toward a truth, both tender and difficult. The truth of change loss and the beauty that can still be found within them. And so the path turns very naturally from the wisdom of boundaries to the deeper truth that makes boundaries compassion and letting go all necessary in the first place. Everything changes. Every face we love, every season of life, every certainty we try to hold still, every joy, every sorrow, every moment of health, every moment of strength, all of it moves within the great river of impermanence. This truth can sound unsettling when heard only with the mind. But when it is understood with the heart, it becomes strangely tender. It teaches us not to love less, but to love more truthfully. Not to become detached in a cold way, but to stop demanding that life remain fixed in forms it was never meant to keep. There is a story that carries this teaching with unusual gentleness, and it begins in a small village in ancient Japan, where an elderly woman we will call Grandmother May was known and loved for her quiet wisdom and peaceful presence. Though many people came to her for comfort, what made her so deeply trusted was not that life had spared her from hardship. It was that hardship had deepened her compassion without hardening her heart. She had lost her husband, raised children through poverty, and endured many seasons of uncertainty. Yet somehow, she had learned how to hold life lightly while loving it deeply. One day, a young mother named Aya came to Grandmother May in terrible distress. Her little daughter, whom we will call Emmy, had fallen gravely ill, and despite the efforts of healers, the child was not improving. Aya was exhausted from fear. She had been lying awake night after night, imagining the worst, praying, desperately bargaining inwardly with fate, and trying to think of some action that might save her daughter from suffering. When she spoke, her words came out in sobs. Emmy was not merely her child. She was her whole world, the center of her love, the living pulse of her hope. The thought of losing her felt unbearable. Grandmother May listened without interruption, holding the young mother's trembling hands with deep compassion, allowing her pain to pour out completely before speaking at all. Then in a voice as soft as morning mist, she said, "Come with me to the garden. There is something I want to show you." Behind Grandmother May's small house stood a beautiful garden, lovingly tended even in late autumn. Stone paths curved between quiet plants. A small pond reflected the fading sky. Flowers still offered colour in sheltered corners, though the season had already begun its letting go. At the centre of the garden stood a cherry tree, old and graceful, its branches mostly bare now, except for a few leaves still clinging to the twigs. Grandmother May placed one weathered hand on the trunk and asked Aya if she saw the tree. She told her that it had been planted the year her first child was born, and that through all the decades since she had watched it move through every season. In spring, it burst into blossoms so beautiful they seemed almost unreal. In summer, it offered cool shade. In autumn, Its leaves flamed gold and red before falling, and in winter it stood bare, and still gathering strength in silence for the life that would return again. Aya looked at the tree, but her mind was too crowded with fear to understand why she had been brought there. Her daughter was ill. Her heart was breaking. A tree felt like a distraction from her urgent need. Sensing this restlessness, Grandmother May continued gently. Each season, she said the tree is perfect, exactly as it is. When the blossoms fall, it does not cling to them or mourn their passing. When the leaves change and drop, it does not resist the transformation or fight the natural order. It understands something human beings often forget, that beauty does not live in permanence. Beauty lives in the graceful acceptance of life's changing cycles. But Aya, overwhelmed with grief, could hardly bear these words. "My daughter is not a tree," she cried. "She is my baby. How can I accept that she may be taken from me? What kind of mother would I be if I simply stood by and accepted this grandmother?" May drew her into a quiet embrace and let her cry. Then she answered with great tenderness. She was not asking Aya to give up hope, nor to stop seeking healing. She should do everything in her power to help her daughter. Seek the best care. Pray if prayer brought comfort. Try every loving thing that could be done. But alongside all that effort, she asked Aya to consider one more: truth. Her daughter, like all beings, was a temporary gift in this world. From the moment she was born, she had entered the same human journey all beings enter a journey with a beginning, a middle, and an end. This did not make her less precious. It made every moment with her infinitely sacred. Then Grandmother May guided Aya to sit beneath the cherry tree and spoke the words that changed her heart. "When we cling too tightly to what we love," she said, "we often miss the joy of loving. Your fear of losing Emmy is stealing your ability to truly be with her now. Every moment spent trembling before a future you cannot control is a moment not spent cherishing the life that is still here in front of you." She asked Aya a question so simple and so piercing that it seemed to stop time. When you look at your daughter now, are you truly seeing her? Or are you only seeing your fear of losing her? The question struck deeply. Aya realized that for weeks she had not really been seeing her child's eyes, her smile, her small living presence. She had been seeing only her own terror reflected back at her. She had become so focused on the possibility of death that she was missing the reality of life still unfolding right in front of her. Grandmother May then picked up a fallen leaf, golden and delicate in the fading light. It had once been part of the tree, drawing life from its branches, dancing in the wind, giving beauty and shade. When its time came, it had let go gracefully, trusting the rhythm larger than itself. Now it would nourish the earth and help new life grow. Nothing, she explained, is ever truly lost in the way we fear. It changes form. It enters another part of the dance. Aya sat in silence for a long time, feeling something soften inside her. At last, she asked what she should do. Grandmother May smiled and told her to go home and love her daughter with all her heart, but to love her as she was not as fear imagined her. Read her stories, sing to her, hold her close, continue seeking healing, yes, but do not let fear steal the precious time they still had together. In the months that followed, little Emmy recovered to the amazement of many. But even more important than the recovery was the lesson that remained. Aya learned to love fully while holding lightly to cherish each day, without being paralyzed by the shadow of possible loss. And this is the gentle doorway through which the Buddhist teaching of impermanence enters the heart, not as a threat, but as an invitation to stop gripping life so tightly that we miss the love that is already here. And once the heart begins to understand impermanence through love, it begins to recognize the same truth in another form, through uncertainty. We learn that change does not only arrive in the quiet language of seasons and falling leaves. Sometimes it arrives as interruption, sometimes as illness, sometimes as the collapse of a future we had carefully arranged in our minds. The old lesson returns in a new shape. Everything changes. Our relationships shift. Our bodies transform. Circumstances move like weather, and much of our suffering comes not only from these changes themselves, but from the exhausting effort to stop them, control them, or deny that they are already happening. The modern world often teaches the opposite. It tells us that safety comes from perfect preparation, that peace comes from building enough systems, enough plans, enough protection around ourselves to keep uncertainty out. Some planning is wise, of course. Some preparation is loving and responsible. But beyond a certain point, the wish to be prepared becomes something tighter and more fearful. It becomes a private war against reality. We start trying to control not only our choices, but outcomes, not only our behavior, but the future, not only our effort, but the entire unfolding of life. And because life has never agreed to such a contract, anxiety quietly grows beneath the surface. We become like people trying to hold back the tide with our hands confused by our own exhaustion, not realizing that the struggle itself is what is draining us. There was once a man living in a busy modern city whom we will call Daniel. He was successful by every outward measure, the sort of person others described as organized, dependable, and always in control. His home was immaculate. His calendar was carefully managed. His finances were planned far into the future. He had detailed strategies for his career advancement, his family's security, and even his retirement decades ahead. He took pride in being the person who anticipated every possibility and left nothing to chance. Friends admired him. Colleagues respected him. His family knew him as responsible and steady. Yet beneath this polished order lived a constant low hum of anxiety. Daniel was always scanning for what might go wrong, always adjusting, always preparing, always trying to stay one step ahead of uncertainty. His control looked like strength from the outside, but inwardly it had become a form of fear. Then life changed without asking his permission. Daniel was diagnosed with a serious autoimmune illness, one that forced him to leave his demanding job far earlier than he had planned. Almost overnight, the carefully designed structure of his life began to collapse. The identity he had built around being a successful executive no longer fit the body he now lived in. The future he had imagined became blurred. His sense of security, once tied so tightly to productivity planning and performance, was shaken at its roots. The treatments drained his energy. The illness made his old routine impossible. Savings that had once felt reassuring now began to shrink under the cost of care. And because Daniel knew only one way to face difficulty, he responded by trying even harder to control everything. For months, he threw himself into management of the crisis, with the same intensity he had once given to business deals. He researched treatments, obsessively sought second and third opinions, built detailed charts of his symptoms, scheduled medications with military precision, and turned healing itself into another project that had to be mastered. He believed somewhere deep inside that if he just worked hard enough, planned carefully enough, pushed intelligently enough, he could force life to return to the shape he preferred. But the harder he fought, the more exhausted and discouraged he became. His wife begged him to slow down and accept help, but he insisted he could still handle everything if he remained disciplined enough. His children began avoiding him because every conversation eventually returned to illness, treatment recovery plans, and the frustrated determination to reclaim his old life. In fighting so fiercely against what was happening, Daniel was missing the life that was still available to him in the present moment. One day, after a difficult appointment that left him feeling defeated, Daniel wandered into a small bookstore near the medical center. He was not particularly spiritual, and he had never thought much about philosophy. But a simple book caught his eye, one whose title spoke quietly of peace and uncertainty. On its cover was a single leaf floating on water, and for reasons he could not explain, the image calmed something in him. As he read, he came across a short teaching from a Zen master, a line so simple that it almost felt too small to matter. What is. What is not. Fighting with reality is like arguing with the weather, exhausting and pointless. Daniel sat with those words for a long time. Something in him finally recognized the truth he had been too tense to see. He had not only been suffering from illness, he had been suffering from furious resistance to illness. He had been fighting the fact that he was sick, fighting the uncertainty of his future, fighting the truth that life does not bend itself to our plans, no matter how carefully we write them. And in that moment, he saw that much of his pain was coming not from what had happened, but from the endless battle he was waging against it. This realization did not instantly transform him. Acceptance rarely arrives all at once. It usually comes slowly, almost shyly, as the body and mind begin to understand that they are wasting precious energy in a war they cannot win. Daniel began with difficulty to practice another way. Instead of spending every day planning how to return to his old identity, he started asking what life might still offer in its present form. He discovered a quiet love of gardening, something he had never made time for before. Working with soil and watching plants grow at their own pace taught him a kind of patience no spreadsheet had ever given him. He began volunteering at a local shelter where helping others facing hardship softened his sense of isolation. Most importantly, he started really listening to his wife and children. He learned that his daughter had been struggling with anxiety for quite some time, something he had never noticed while he was absorbed in work and control. He began to see gifts that had been present in his life all along, hidden beneath the constant pressure of busyness and self-management. As his stress gradually eased, even his health began to improve. But the deeper healing was not physical. It was inward. Daniel was beginning to understand that real security does not come from controlling external conditions. It comes from developing the inner flexibility to meet life as it unfolds with clarity, humility, and grace. 0 seconds / greater than. And so from Daniel's story, the path turns not toward passivity, but toward a very practical kind of wisdom. Letting go is not the same as giving up. It does not mean becoming careless, detached, or unwilling to act. It means learning to distinguish between what belongs to your care and what does not belong to your control. You can guide your effort, but not every outcome. You can choose your response, but not every circumstance. You can offer love, patience, honesty, and courage, but you cannot force life to obey your preferred shape. This is why letting go is not weakness. It is a return of energy. It is the quiet decision to stop pouring your strength into battles that cannot be won, so that your strength may be used where it truly matters. There is a simple practice in the original teaching that helps this wisdom move from understanding into direct experience. It begins by bringing to mind something you have been trying to control, or something you are afraid of losing. It may be a relationship that is changing, a health concern that will not leave your thoughts alone, an uncertain situation at work, or some quiet fear about the future that tends to visit you when the world grows dark and still. Once you have brought this concern gently into awareness, you do not need to analyze it. You do not need to solve it immediately. You only need to notice what happens in the body when the mind grips it tightly. Perhaps the shoulders tense. Perhaps the chest narrows. Perhaps the stomach hardens into a knot. The body often tells the truth before the mind is ready to admit it. Clinging has a cost, and the body feels that cost very clearly. Now imagine very softly that this concern is resting in your open palms. Not crushed in your fist, not hidden away, not denied, but held gently like a small bird that has been frightened and needs room to breathe. Let the image be simple. You care about this deeply. That is why it is in your hands. But as you take a slow, unforced breath in and then exhale fully, imagine your hands opening a little more. Imagine allowing the bird to lift and fly. You are not throwing it away. You are not saying it does not matter. You are only releasing the desperate need to control where it lands, how it moves, or what happens next. Inwardly, you may say something like this: I care about this deeply, and I release my need to control it. I will do what I can with love and wisdom, and I will trust life with the rest. Then notice, without strain, whether anything in the body softens, even by a small degree. Often, there is a little more space in the chest, a little less pressure in the jaw, a little more breath available than there was before. This is what it feels like to hold life with an open hand, rather than a closed one. The beauty of this practice is that it does not ask you to stop caring. In fact, it asks for a more honest kind of care. Clinging often disguises itself as love, but they are not the same. Love can breathe. Clinging cannot. Love allows reality to move. Clinging tries to pin reality to the wall. Love says, I am here with all my heart. Clinging says, this must not change. And because everything in life changes, clinging guarantees strain. The open palms of letting go do not make you colder. They make you more available, more present, and less haunted by the impossible burden of trying to manage what has never truly belonged to you in the first place. This same art of release applies not only to circumstances, but also to emotions. One of the most liberating discoveries in Buddhist psychology is that emotions, no matter how powerful they feel, are impermanent. Sadness changes, fear changes, anger changes, anxiety changes. Even joy changes. This does not mean emotions are unimportant, and it does not mean they should be suppressed. It simply means they are whether not identity. A feeling may be passing through you, but it is not the whole of what you are. When a difficult emotion arises, the practice is not to push it away or become lost inside it. The practice is to notice it clearly, name it gently, remember that it is temporary, and breathe with it rather than against it. You might quietly say, "There is anxiety here right now," or "Sadness is moving through me," or "Anger is present." This feeling is here, but it will change. I do not need to hold on to it, and I do not need to force it away. Then instead of fighting the emotion, you let the breath keep it company with kindness, as though sitting beside a distressed friend without trying to silence them. From there, you offer yourself the same compassion you would offer someone you love. This is hard right now, and that is okay. It is natural to feel this way. May I be kind to myself in this moment. And the practice goes even deeper still. Many people are not only holding on to circumstances and emotions, they are also holding on to stories about who they are. I am always anxious. I am not creative. I am too damaged to change. I am not the kind of person who gets to be peaceful. These stories can become so familiar that they begin to feel like truth. But the teaching reminds us to hold these self-concepts lightly as well. They are thoughts, not final definitions. They are mental constructions, not the whole of your being. You are not your past mistakes. You are not your future fears. You are not even the passing conditions of this current season of life. You are the aware presence in which all of these thoughts arise and pass, like clouds moving through a wide and patient sky. When this is remembered, even briefly, there is tremendous relief. You do not have to carry every label the mind has attached to you. You do not have to keep repeating every old sentence just because it has been repeated often. Thoughts can loosen. Identities can soften. Life can move again. This is the art of letting go in its most tender form. Not throwing life away, but ceasing to choke it with fear. Not becoming empty, but becoming spacious. Not resisting every change, but learning how to meet change without losing the ground of your own heart. And once this spaciousness begins to grow, another beautiful quality naturally appears. It is the quality of balance, the calm willingness to let events unfold without rushing to call them blessings or disasters too quickly. It is here that the path now turns next toward an old story about a farmer who understood that life is often too mysterious to judge by a single day. There was once an old farmer living in a quiet village in China. He was not famous, not wealthy, and not considered particularly extraordinary by those around him. He simply lived close to the earth, tending his fields, repairing his fences, feeding his animals, and moving through the days with a calm that many people noticed, but few understood. He had a son who worked beside him, and together they depended heavily on one beautiful horse for ploughing and transport. In the eyes of the village, the horse was one of the family's greatest assets, a sign that the farmer had been favored by fortune in some small but meaningful way. Then one morning, the horse broke through a section of fence and ran away into the hills. By afternoon, neighbors had begun arriving at the farmer's home, shaking their heads with sympathy. "What terrible luck," they said. "Such a fine horse, and now it is gone. This is a great misfortune." But the old farmer did not seem shaken in the way they expected. He listened politely, nodded once or twice, and then answered with words that puzzled everyone. Maybe he said, "We'll see." His voice was neither cheerful nor bitter. It held no denial, but it carried no panic either. It was simply steady, as though he understood something about life that did not fit the villagers' quick conclusions. A few days later, the missing horse returned, but it did not return alone. It came back with 3 wild horses from the hills, strong and untamed, following behind it, like a gift carried in by the wind. When the neighbors saw this, they came running once again, their faces bright with delight. "How wonderful!" they exclaimed. "What great fortune! Your loss has turned into blessing. Now you have 4 horses instead of 1. But the old farmer only smiled faintly and said the same words as before. Maybe, he replied, "We'll see." The villagers found this response almost impossible to understand. Why would he not celebrate? Why would he not call good luck? Good luck. Yet the farmer continued with his usual tasks, neither clinging to the return of the horses, nor building a future out of the pleasant surprise. He simply stayed with what was there without rushing to turn it into a permanent story. Sometime later, his son tried to train one of the wild horses. The animal threw him violently to the ground, and the young man's leg was badly broken. Again, the neighbors gathered, this time with mournful faces and sorrowful voices. "What bad fortune," they said. "Your only son is injured, and the harvest season is near. This is a terrible blow." Once again, the old farmer listened, and once again, he answered in the same simple way. Maybe, he said, "We'll see." The villagers by now thought him strange. To them, life was easy to interpret. Pleasant events were good. Painful events were bad. Gain was blessing. Loss was disaster. But the farmer moved more slowly than that. He seemed unwilling to judge a single chapter as if it were the whole story. He did not reject feeling. He did not pretend that his son's broken leg was convenient or easy, yet neither did he surrender to the mind's hunger for immediate conclusions. He understood perhaps that life unfolds in patterns too wide for quick judgment. Not long after the region was drawn into war and soldiers came through the village conscripting every young man fit to fight. One by one, sons were taken from their homes. Mothers wept. Fathers stood helpless in doorways, and the entire village trembled beneath the weight of uncertainty. But when the soldiers came to the farmer's house and saw his son's broken leg, they left him behind. He was unfit for service. The neighbors returned once more, this time with amazement in their eyes. "How fortunate," they said. "Your son is spared. What seemed like disaster has become a blessing." And the farmer, still calm, still steady, still unwilling to imprison life inside a hurried opinion, said again, "Maybe we'll see." This old story has endured for centuries because it reveals something the anxious mind constantly forgets. We almost always judge life too quickly. We meet an event and immediately decide what it means for our future, our happiness, our identity, our safety. We lose a job and assume life is collapsing. A plan falls through and we call it failure. An unexpected delay appears and we name it disaster. A praise-filled moment arrives and we assume it will last. A joyful season opens and we build our whole sense of security around it. But again and again, life proves larger stranger and less obedient to our quick interpretations than we imagine. What seems painful today may open a necessary door tomorrow. What appears favorable now may later reveal hidden trouble. We do not see the whole pattern. we rarely can. This is why the farmer's answer holds such deep Buddhist wisdom. Maybe we'll see is not indifference, it is equanimity. It is the calm refusal to be thrown violently around by every rise and fall of circumstance. It is the understanding that life keeps unfolding beyond the edge of our current view, and that our peace need not depend on calling each moment a triumph or a catastrophe the instant it appears. Equanimity does not mean the heart becomes numb. It means the heart becomes spacious enough to hold uncertainty without panic. It means joy can be enjoyed without clinging, and pain can be felt without immediately becoming despair. This quality becomes especially important in our modern lives where the mind is trained to react quickly to everything. A single email can disturb the whole nervous system. A message unanswered for too long becomes evidence of rejection. A financial shift becomes a story of ruin. A compliment becomes proof of worth. A criticism becomes proof of failure. We are constantly tempted to give each moment a permanent name before the larger movement of life has revealed itself. The old farmer teaches another rhythm. Slow down. Do not hand your peace over to first impressions. Let events breathe before you decide what they are. Let life unfold one step further before you announce that all is lost or all is won. And perhaps there is something deeply restful in that. You do not have to know exactly what everything means tonight. You do not have to solve the mystery of your future before you are allowed to exhale. You do not need to label every uncertainty as danger, nor every pleasure as something that must be held at all costs. Sometimes, the wisest thing the heart can say is the simplest. Maybe. We'll see. In those quiet words, there is humility, patience, and trust. There is room for life to be more complex than fear assumes. There is room for grace to arrive in forms the mind did not predict. And there is room too for the next step on the path. The step in which equanimity becomes not only a way of thinking, but a way of living with open hands and a steady heart. 0 seconds / greater than. And so the old farmer's quiet answer opens into a deeper quality of the heart, one that Buddhist teaching treasures very highly. This quality is equanimity. It is not coldness, and it is not a lack of feeling. It is the calm balance that allows us to remain present through gain and loss, praise and blame, pleasure and pain, success and disappointment, without being completely swept away by any of them. Equanimity does not ask the heart to stop loving life. It teaches the heart how to love life without trying to imprison it. It teaches us how to stand in the changing weather of existence without demanding that every cloud becomes sunlight before we are willing to rest. And perhaps the simplest image for this is the one we have already been approaching for some time now. The difference between a closed fist and an open hand. A closed fist tries to keep. It tightens around people, outcomes, identities, and hopes. It says, this must stay, this must not change, this must go according to my design. But the more tightly life is gripped, the more strain enters the body and mind. A fist cannot receive very well. It cannot feel very gently. It cannot rest. An open hand is different. An open hand can still hold, but it holds lightly. It can care without choking. It can welcome without clinging. It can release without becoming empty. To live with an open hand is to say yes to love, yes to effort, yes to beauty, yes to responsibility, while also saying yes to the truth that none of these can be controlled completely. This is equanimity in living form. It is not withdrawal from life. It is intimacy with life, but without the violence of grasping. This matters because so much suffering comes not from caring too much, but from trying to turn care into control. We love someone and then quietly begin bargaining with impermanence. We work toward a dream and then insist that our worth depends on achieving it. We experience a season of happiness and then grow tense with fear that it may pass. Even spiritual practice can become another form of grasping if we cling to calm, cling to progress, cling to the idea of becoming a better, purer, more peaceful version of ourselves. But life keeps teaching the same lesson in different voices. The blossoms fall, the horse runs away and returns. Health changes, relationships evolve, emotions move like tides. The open hand does not deny any of this. It learns to remain soft in the middle of it. To understand equanimity more fully, it helps to see what it is not. It is not passivity. It does not mean saying nothing matters, so why try? It does not mean watching injustice without responding, or treating love and loss as equally irrelevant. The equanimous heart still acts. It still protects. It still serves. It still grieves. It still delights. The difference is that it no longer believes its inner peace must rise and fall in complete obedience to circumstance. A person with equanimity may work very hard for something good, but inwardly they are less entangled in the outcome. They bring full sincerity to the action and a softer grip to the result. They understand that wise effort belongs to them, but the unfolding of life belongs to life. This is why equanimity is sometimes described as the companion of compassion. Without equanimity, compassion can become exhausting. We feel the pain of the world and then try to carry all of it ourselves. We love someone and then become consumed by fear for them. We want to help and then break our own hearts on the fact that we cannot prevent every sorrow. But when compassion is joined by equanimity, love becomes steadier. We can care deeply without drowning. We can remain present without being shattered by every wave. We can offer support, tenderness, listening, practical help, and prayerful goodwill, while also remembering that each being is walking their own path through causes and conditions far larger than our individual will. This does not make love smaller. It makes it cleaner, wiser, and more sustainable. You can feel this even now in something as simple as the breath. When you inhale, life comes in. When you exhale, life goes out. If you try to keep the breath forever, it becomes suffocation. If you refuse the next inhale, life dims. Breathing itself is a perfect teacher of equanimity. Receive, release, receive, release. Nothing is held forever, and yet nothing is lost by moving in this rhythm. The peace of the body depends on it. In much the same way, the peace of the heart depends on learning the rhythm of opening and letting go, loving and releasing, acting and trusting. The fist gets tired. The open hand remains alive. And perhaps this is one of the quiet transformations the teachings have been guiding us toward all along. First, we learned to see suffering clearly. Then we saw how the mind adds to suffering through grasping and resistance. Then we learned mindfulness, the art of returning to the present. Then, loving kindness softened the heart. Boundaries gave that softness wisdom. Impermanence taught us to cherish rather than cling. Letting go loosened what had become too tight. And now, equanimity gathers all of this together into a more stable way of being. Not because life has stopped changing, but because the heart is no longer asking change to stop before it can be at peace. When this understanding matures, it begins to enter very ordinary moments. It enters the way you respond to a difficult message. It enters the way you sit beside a loved one whose pain you cannot fix. It enters the way you meet your own uncertainty at night. It enters the way you enjoy a good day without trying to force it to last forever. In other words, the teachings begin to leave the meditation cushion and enter the kitchen, the workplace, the family table, the hallway, the car, the sleepless hour, the hospital room, the ordinary texture of being alive. And that is where our path now turns next, because wisdom is most beautiful when it becomes lived, not merely understood. The next part of the journey brings these teachings into daily life itself, into work relationships, and the small, unnoticed spaces where peace quietly learns how to walk among us. And so the teachings begin to leave the level of reflection and enter the living texture of ordinary days. This is where many people quietly begin to doubt them. Ancient wisdom can sound beautiful in the night, beautiful in stillness, beautiful when the room is quiet and the breath is slow. But what happens on Monday morning? What happens in traffic, in workplaces, in difficult conversations, in noise, in fatigue, in all the places where peace seems to vanish the moment real life begins? The Buddhist path answers this very directly. Peace is not meant only for ideal conditions. If it exists only in silence, then it is too fragile to guide a human life. Real practice must be able to walk into chaos without disappearing. It must be able to breathe inside noise, to remain present inside pressure, and to keep the heart open in places where there is no perfect stillness to protect it. There was in a modern city by the sea a nurse whom we will call Clara. For several years she had been practicing meditation faithfully. Each morning before dawn, she sat quietly in her small apartment, breathing, observing, and settling into a peace that felt deep and real. In those early hours before the phones began ringing and the world began asking things of her, she could touch a stillness that seemed almost sacred. Her mind softened. Her body relaxed. The day looked manageable from that place. But the moment she arrived at the busy hospital where she worked, that peace seemed to evaporate. The hospital was everything her meditation cushion was not. It was noisy, chaotic, emotionally charged, and deeply unpredictable. Patients were frightened and sometimes angry. Families were anxious and demanding. Colleagues were exhausted, overworked, and carrying their own invisible burdens. By the end of most shifts, Clara felt as though she were living two separate lives: the peaceful meditator in the morning and the frazzled nurse by afternoon, with no bridge between them. This troubled her more and more, eventually frustrated by the growing split between her spiritual life and her working life. She sought guidance from an older teacher whom we will call Sister Helen, a woman who had spent decades studying both Zen practice and the psychology of the human heart. Clara described her problem plainly. "I can find peace in my bedroom," she said, "but I lose it the moment I step into the real world. What is the point of meditation if it cannot help me where I need it most?" Sister Helen listened with quiet understanding, and then asked a question so simple that Clara almost missed its depth. When you meditate at home, she said, what makes you feel peaceful? Clara answered after a pause. The quiet, I suppose. The stillness. No one demanding anything from me. Time to just breathe and be. Sister Helen nodded and then asked, and what do you think meditation is really about? Is it about the external conditions? Or is it about something you cultivate within yourself? That question stopped Clara completely. She realized she had been treating peace as something dependent on ideal conditions, as though calm belonged only to silence, rather than being a quality that could be carried within her into any environment. Sister Helen then said something Clara would remember for years. The hospital, she told her, is not the enemy of your practice. It is the gymnasium where your practice grows strong. Every patient, she explained, offered an opportunity to practice compassion. Every stressful moment was a chance to return to the breath. Every difficult colleague was a teacher of patience. The problem was not that Clara's peace disappeared at work. The problem was that she had imagined peace should depend on circumstances being gentle. Once she saw this, a new possibility opened. Practice did not need to be reserved for quiet mornings. Practice could happen in motion, in corridors, in strained conversations, in moments of fatigue, in the very center of the life she was already living. So over the following weeks, Clara began experimenting with what Sister Helen called stealth meditation. She did not announce it. She did not turn it into something dramatic. She simply wove it quietly into the fabric of her day. While walking down hospital corridors, she practiced mindful walking, feeling each step and using the rhythm of movement as an anchor to presence. During brief pauses between tasks, instead of reaching automatically for her phone or letting her mind spiral into the next demand, she took 3 conscious breaths and checked in with her inner state. When difficult patients spoke harshly from pain or fear, she silently offered them loving wishes. May your pain ease. May you feel safe. May you find peace. Nothing outward looked extraordinary. Yet inwardly, a bridge was being built between meditation and life. The transformation was not immediate, and that is important to remember. Deep practice rarely changes life all at once. It changes the atmosphere gradually, almost invisibly at first. But over time, Clara noticed something remarkable. She still worked in the same noisy hospital. The same pressures existed. The same suffering moved through the rooms. And yet her presence within those conditions had changed. Agitated patients sometimes calmed when she entered. Worried family members softened when she spoke to them. Even colleagues under strain began seeking her out during difficult shifts, drawn not by anything she preached, but by the steadiness she had quietly begun to embody. This is how the teachings bear fruit in daily life. Not always through dramatic revelations, but through the subtle, powerful fact that inner calm affects the world around it. Clara's story reveals something essential. Integrating Buddhist practice into daily life does not require extra hours, a mountaintop retreat, or the removal of difficulty. It requires a shift in perspective. Instead of seeing work-family stress, traffic, and interruption as obstacles to practice, we begin to see them as the very places where practice becomes real. A difficult workplace no longer appears only as a source of irritation. It becomes a field for patience. A demanding interaction becomes a chance to pause before reacting. The body's tension becomes a bell of mindfulness. pressure becomes an invitation to breathe consciously, rather than to disappear into old habits. And this matters far beyond hospitals. The same principle applies anywhere human beings are human together. In offices, in schools, in homes, in long lines, crowded streets, family meals, unexpected disappointments, and all the places where the mind is tempted to say, "Not here, not now. I will practice later when life becomes easier." But later is the mind's favorite hiding place. The path keeps bringing us back to now. This breath, this moment, this difficult person, this small opportunity to remain present instead of reactive. So the question gently changes. Instead of asking, "How do I protect my peace from the world?" we begin asking, "How do I carry peace into the world?" And once that question becomes real, another one naturally follows. If ordinary life itself is the field of practice, then how do we meet specific tensions inside it? Especially the friction of difficult co-workers, demanding bosses, and the everyday interactions that so easily pull us out of center. That is where the path now continues, as practice becomes even more practical, even more immediate, and even more deeply woven into the living details of each day. And so the practice becomes even more practical, because one of the clearest places where peace is tested is not in silence, but in the ordinary friction of work. A difficult colleague, a demanding supervisor, a tense meeting, an email written in the wrong tone, a careless remark at the end of a long day. These are the moments when old habits rise quickly. The body tightens. The face grows warm. The mind prepares its defense before a single wise thought has time to enter. This is why the workplace can become such a powerful field of practice. It reveals with great honesty where reactivity still lives inside us, and it offers repeated chances to choose something different. The usual responses are familiar. We complain to others. We avoid the person if we can. We replay the interaction over and over in our minds. Or we become equally sharp, in return answering tension with tension and adding our own pain to a situation already full of it. For a brief moment, this can feel satisfying, but the satisfaction rarely lasts. More often, it leaves a residue in the body, a heaviness in the mind, and a lingering disturbance that follows us home. Buddhist practice offers another possibility. It asks us to remember right in the middle of irritation that difficult behavior almost always grows out of suffering. The boss who seems unreasonable may be under enormous pressure from above. The co-worker who behaves rudely may be carrying private grief, fear, exhaustion, or some burden we cannot see. This does not excuse harmful behavior, and it does not mean we should become passive. It simply allows us to respond from wisdom rather than from immediate emotional reaction. The first step is beautifully small. Notice the body. Before the mind begins building its story, notice the shoulders tightening, the heat in the chest, the jaw becoming firm, the quick desire either to attack or defend. This moment of noticing matters more than it first appears, because it interrupts the old chain before it gains momentum. Then take one conscious breath. Just one. A single steady breath creates a little space between what is happening and the version of you that might otherwise react blindly. In that small space, a wiser self has time to arrive. From there, the teaching suggests an inner gesture of compassion. Silently, without anyone knowing, you might say something like, "This person is suffering right now. Or may this person find peace. Not because they are being pleasant, not because their behavior is acceptable, but because you are choosing not to pour more anger into a fire that is already burning. This is one of the most practical uses of compassion. It protects your own mind from becoming the next source of harm. And often, though, not always, the inner shift changes the outer dynamic as well. People tend to respond differently when they are met by calm clarity rather than defensive heat. Then comes the most important part. Respond to the actual situation, not to the storm your nervous system is trying to create around it. If a boundary needs to be set, set it. If a misunderstanding needs to be clarified, clarify it. If a problem must be named, directly name it. But do so from the centered place, opened by that breath, not from the wound of the moment. This is the difference between reaction and response. Reaction throws pain outward as quickly as possible. Response remains anchored enough to choose words that are honest without becoming cruel, direct without becoming punishing, and firm without losing dignity. You may be surprised by how powerful this becomes over time. A difficult workplace does not necessarily become easy, but it becomes less able to invade the deepest rooms of your inner life. The rude comment does not follow you for hours in quite the same way. The tension of a meeting no longer has total authority over the rest of your day. You begin to see that peace is not the absence of pressure, but the growing capacity to meet pressure without surrendering your center. This is the fruit of stealth meditation, fully entering real life. A breath in the hallway, a pause before the reply, a silent wish for someone else's relief, a calm boundary spoken without bitterness. None of these look dramatic from the outside, but together they quietly transform the whole atmosphere of a day. And once this shift begins in the workplace, it naturally prepares the heart for an even subtler challenge. Because often, the people who trigger us most are not colleagues or bosses at all. They are the people we love. A partner, a parent, a child, a close friend. In those relationships, we are rarely disturbed only by what is said on the surface. We are disturbed by history, expectation, fear, longing, and the deep wish to be understood. So the path now moves from the tensions of work into the tenderness of intimate life, where another practice becomes essential. The practice of truly listening, not merely waiting for your turn to speak, but listening so fully that another person can feel, perhaps for the first time in a long while, that they are genuinely being met. And so the path moves from the outer tensions of work into the inner tenderness of family life, where practice often becomes both more difficult and more necessary. It is one thing to stay calm with a colleague you can leave behind at the end of a shift. It is another thing entirely to remain open with the people whose voices reach the deepest places in your heart. A child, a partner, a parent, a close friend. These relationships do not stir us only because of what is said in a given moment. They stir us because of love, history, expectation, fear, and the longing to be seen. This is why Buddhist teaching places such quiet importance on deep listening. Not listening in order to fix, not listening in order to win, not listening while secretly preparing your reply, but listening as a form of meditation in action with full presence, no agenda, and no immediate need to reshape the other person's experience. In this kind of listening, attention itself becomes an offering. You listen not only to words, but to the feeling beneath the words, the need beneath the complaint, the tenderness hidden under frustration or defiance. And sometimes that quality of listening becomes the doorway through which a relationship begins to heal. There was once a father whom we will call Michael, and for many years he had shared an easy, affectionate closeness with his daughter Lily. When she was younger, their bond felt natural. They laughed often, talked freely, and moved through daily life with the uncomplicated warmth many parents quietly hope will last forever. But as Lily entered her teenage years, something changed. Their conversations became tense. What had once felt easy now seemed to catch on every small thing. Michael would ask a simple question and receive a sharp answer. He would try to offer guidance and watch her retreat behind irritation or silence. Again and again, ordinary exchanges ended with Lily storming off to her room while Michael stood in the hallway, feeling confused, hurt, and increasingly helpless. Like many loving parents, he interpreted the distance as a problem to solve, and because he cared so deeply, he tried harder. He prepared long talks about responsibility, safety-wise choices, and respect. He answered her emotional storms with logic explanations and carefully reasoned advice. But the more he tried to fix her experience, the more space opened between them. What he heard as wisdom, she heard as pressure. What he intended as help, she felt as not being understood. Eventually, feeling the ache of that distance more than he knew how to admit, Michael began attending a small, weekly Buddhist discussion group at a local community center. He did not arrive there looking for anything dramatic. He simply wanted some way back to his daughter. At the group, he heard a teacher explain that many communication problems are not really caused by a lack of correct words. They are caused by a lack of presence. When someone feels that you are listening only to correct them, improve them, or prepare your rebuttal, they naturally begin to close. But when they sense genuine curiosity, when they feel that you are trying to understand their inner world, rather than immediately manage it, something softens. The teacher described this as mindful listening, and her words landed deeply in Michael because he suddenly saw how often he had been listening only for the opening through which he could insert advice. He loved his daughter, but he had not been fully meeting her. He had been meeting his fear for her, his hopes for her, his ideas about who she should be. So he decided quietly to try another way. The next time Lily came home upset about a problem at school, Michael felt the old habit rise immediately. He wanted to fix, explain, reassure, and steer the whole situation toward a more reasonable shape. But instead of following that impulse, he paused. He took in a slow breath, and then he simply listened. When Lily complained that a teacher had treated her unfairly, he did not launch into a lecture about authority or tell her she might be overreacting. He asked very gently what that had felt like for her. He said it sounded frustrating. He wondered aloud how she had experienced the moment. The questions were simple, but they came from a completely different place. They did not try to trap her or correct her. They invited her inward, and something almost magical began to happen. Lily, perhaps surprised by not being interrupted or improved, started speaking more honestly than she had in a long time. She talked about feeling invisible in class, about the pressure to fit in with certain groups, about the fear that she was not smart enough for the advanced classes she had been placed in. Beneath the sharpness Michael had been reacting to, he discovered a vulnerable, thoughtful, uncertain young person who had not needed more instruction as much as she had needed to be understood. This did not solve everything in a single evening. Lily was still a teenager, still changing, still moving through the normal storms of becoming herself. But their relationship began to shift because Michael's way of meeting her had shifted. Instead of speaking mostly to the version of his daughter he thought she should be, he began meeting the daughter who was actually in front of him. This is very close to what Buddhist teaching calls unconditional positive regard, loving someone as they are, not merely as you wish they were. It does not mean abandoning guidance. It does not mean failing to set boundaries or pretending every choice is harmless. It means understanding that lasting change grows more naturally from acceptance and love than from pressure and criticism. People, especially the people closest to us, often soften, not when they are cornered by advice, but when they are given the rare and healing experience of being truly heard. Deep listening is therefore much more than a communication technique. It is a spiritual practice of making room. It asks you to set down, for a little while, your certainty, your rehearsed conclusions, your wish to control the outcome of the conversation, and simply stay present with another human being. In many families, this alone changes the atmosphere more than any brilliant speech ever could. A child who feels heard becomes less defensive. A partner who feels heard becomes less guarded. A friend who feels heard becomes more willing to show what is real beneath the surface. And perhaps the deepest reason this matters is that so much suffering grows in isolation. To be listened to without agenda is to be reminded that one does not have to carry one's inner world alone. As Michael continued practicing this, he found that deep listening changed him as much as it changed Lily. It made him more patient. It made him more humble about how little he could know from the outside of another person's experience. It taught him that love is not always expressed through answers. Sometimes it is expressed through attention. Sometimes the kindest thing you can offer is not a solution, but a calm presence that says, with no need for grand language, I am here, and I am trying to understand. And from that kind of presence, another kind of strength naturally begins to grow, the kind that helps a person stay centered, even when life becomes fast demanding and overwhelming. This is the strength the teachings call resilience, and it is where the path now turns next. And so the practice deepens into something even more intimate and even more useful, because resilience is not built only in dramatic moments. It is built in small returns. It is built in the quiet decision to come back to yourself before the mind runs too far ahead, before emotion hardens into identity, before the day carries you so quickly that you forget you are even here. In Buddhist teaching, one of the most beautiful ways of describing this is the idea of taking refuge. This does not mean hiding from life or escaping difficulty. It means learning where to return when life becomes overwhelming. You take refuge in your breath when the mind is scattered. You take refuge in compassion when the heart begins to close. You take refuge in the present moment when fear pulls you into an imagined future. Refuge is not a faraway temple. It is an inner home you learn to enter again and again until the way back becomes more familiar than the habit of panic. This is why it helps to create what we might call a portable peace practice, something simple enough to travel with you into the ordinary hours of the day. Not a long ritual that depends on perfect conditions, but a small set of gentle returns that can be used anywhere. Stuck in traffic, you take 3 conscious breaths and feel your hands resting on the wheel. In the middle of a difficult meeting, while others speak too sharply or too quickly, you silently repeat a quiet phrase to steady yourself. Perhaps this too shall pass, or breathe and soften, or simply here now. After making a mistake, instead of attacking yourself inwardly, you place a hand over your heart for a moment and offer yourself the same kindness you would offer a dear friend. None of these actions appear dramatic from the outside, yet they are deeply powerful because they interrupt the old chain of unconscious stress and make space for another quality of mind to enter. Over time, the heart learns that it does not need to wait for the end of the day, the weekend, the vacation, or some future season of ease before it is allowed to exhale. Peace can be touched in very small moments, right in the middle of life as it is. The original teaching makes another point here that is both practical and comforting. The key is consistency rather than duration. 2 minutes of conscious breathing every few hours can do more to reshape the inner atmosphere of a life than occasional long sessions, performed only when time and mood happen to align. This is because the mind is formed by repetition. A river does not carve stone through one dramatic gesture. It shapes the landscape through steady contact. In the same way, short and faithful acts of returning begin to change the nervous system, the tone of thought, and the way the body meets experience. You may still have difficult days. You may still be pulled by old habits, but the path back becomes shorter. Recovery becomes gentler. The storm passes through with less destruction because there is now a place within you that remembers how to stay, how to breathe, and how to soften before reaction takes over. And yet resilience is not only about calming the body in stressful moments. It is also about learning how to work wisely with the habits of the mind itself. Buddhist teaching observes with remarkable psychological accuracy that the mind has a natural tendency to notice danger more quickly than beauty problems, more quickly than blessings. What is wrong more quickly than what is quietly sustaining us. This tendency once helped human beings survive because attention to threat was necessary in a harsh and uncertain world. But in modern life, where the mind is bombarded all day with pressure-speed noise and stimulation, this old pattern often becomes a source of unnecessary suffering. We begin to scan constantly for what might go wrong. We remember criticism more strongly than kindness. We carry one troubling conversation in our thoughts while overlooking 10 quiet moments of goodness that were also part of the day. If this habit is not gently retrained, the mind begins to feel like a room in which only shadows are ever noticed, even when light has been entering all along. This is why the next movement of the path arises so naturally from resilience. Once you know how to return to yourself, the heart becomes ready to learn how to notice what it has been overlooking. Not to deny difficulty, not to force positivity, and not to pretend pain is unreal, but to restore balance to perception. To let the mind register not only what is painful, but also what is nourishing. Not only what is missing, but also what is already here. A sip of warm tea, a kind message, a patch of morning light on the wall, the relief of sitting down after a long day, the softness in someone's voice when they ask if you are all right. These things may seem small, but they are not small to the nervous system, and they are not small to the heart. When they are noticed fully, they begin to accumulate as a different kind of wealth, a quiet inner steadiness that no longer depends entirely on life becoming easier before it can be felt. And this is where our journey now turns next, toward the practice of appreciative awareness, the gentle art of teaching the mind to receive the goodness that has been present all along. And so, the practice turns towards something very gentle and yet deeply transformative. Once you begin learning how to return to yourself in difficult moments, another question quietly appears. What do you return to? If the mind has spent years training itself to notice pressure, danger, disappointment, and what is still unresolved, then even when life offers something nourishing, the heart may pass by it too quickly to receive it. This is why Buddhist teaching includes the practice of appreciative awareness. It is not the denial of pain, and it is not an attempt to force yourself into artificial positivity. It is the conscious choice to let the mind register goodness when goodness is actually present. It is the art of receiving what is already here, instead of living as though only what is missing deserves your attention. The mind left untrained tends to notice problems more quickly than blessings. It catches criticism with astonishing speed, while kindness may pass by almost unrecorded. It rehearses what went wrong at the end of the day, while forgetting the small gestures that also filled those same hours with quiet grace. This tendency is not a moral failure. It is simply part of how the human mind has been shaped. But the fact that a tendency is natural does not mean it must rule us forever. Appreciative awareness gently restores balance. It teaches the heart not to ignore difficulty, but to stop overlooking the countless subtle moments that also sustain life. The practice itself is beautifully simple. When something pleasant happens, pause, let it land. If you taste something warm and delicious, do not rush past it, as if eating were only another task to complete. Let yourself truly notice the flavor, the warmth, the comfort of nourishment entering the body. If someone speaks kindly to you, do not brush the moment aside out of habit or embarrassment. Let the kindness be received. If you witness something beautiful, the evening sky changing color, sunlight through a window, the laughter of a child, the gentleness in someone's face, do not merely glance at it and move on. Stay with it for a breath or two longer than usual. Let it touch you. Let it nourish some tired part of your inner life. This may sound almost too small to matter, but small things shape the atmosphere of a life. A mind that has learned only to grip around what is wrong becomes exhausted, suspicious, and hungry in ways it cannot even name. But a mind that begins noticing simple goodness becomes less starved. It becomes less frantic. It begins to trust that life is not made only of burdens and unfinished tasks. There is warmth here too. There is beauty here too. There is kindness, rest, tenderness, and ordinary grace woven quietly into the fabric of the day. Appreciative awareness is simply the practice of allowing those threads to be seen. And perhaps one of the loveliest parts of this teaching is that it asks for no special setting. You do not need a retreat center a mountain path, or a perfectly silent room. The practice can happen in the kitchen, in the car, in a hallway, in a grocery line, in the tired hour before sleep. You drink a cup of tea and truly taste it. You step outside and feel cool air on your skin. You hear a familiar voice and pause long enough to appreciate the comfort it brings. You finish a difficult task and allow yourself one quiet breath of acknowledgement, rather than racing immediately toward the next demand. These moments may seem ordinary, but they are not spiritually insignificant. They are exactly where life is being lived. This is also why appreciative awareness is not selfish. When the heart becomes less deprived, it becomes more generous. A person who has learned to receive simple goodness is often more able to offer goodness. They become less harsh, less grasping, less desperate for life to prove itself through constant achievement. They can sit with another person more calmly. They can endure discomfort with more steadiness. They can meet ordinary days without needing each one to be extraordinary in order to feel worthwhile. Contentment grows quietly in this way, not from accumulating more, but from finally noticing what has already been given. There is another subtle wisdom here as well. Appreciative awareness helps correct a common misunderstanding about happiness. Many people spend years believing happiness must arrive as something large, dramatic, and undeniable. A perfect relationship, a major success, a future moment when all worries have been resolved. But life is rarely arranged in such a complete way. More often, happiness appears in small visitations. The cool side of the pillow, the relief after tears, a meal shared without hurry, a kind text at the right moment, the softness of clean sheets, the quiet sound of rain when you are finally indoors. If the heart dismisses these because they are not grand enough, it may live surrounded by blessings and still feel impoverished. Appreciative awareness teaches another way. Let small goodness count. Let it enter. Let it matter. And over time, this changes more than mood. It changes perception. The world begins to look different, not because problems have vanished, but because the mind is no longer staring only at its wounds. It learns to hold the full spectrum of experience, sorrow and sweetness, uncertainty and beauty, effort and rest. This is a more truthful way of living, not blind optimism, not pessimism disguised as realism, just a deeper willingness to see the whole of life, including the gifts that appear quietly and do not insist on being noticed. The original teaching says something especially tender here. When you witness beauty, kindness, or simple nourishment, allow yourself to be nourished by it. That phrase matters. So many people stand beside goodness without receiving it. They see it, but do not let it in. They move past it too quickly. Appreciative awareness asks you to stop for a moment and let life feed you where it can. A little warmth, a little gratitude, a little peace. These are not small things for the soul, and once this way of seeing begins to grow, it naturally changes how even the most ordinary duties are experienced. A task that once felt dull begins to hold texture, rhythm, and quiet meaning. Work done with attention begins to feel different from work done in resentment. A routine action repeated every day begins to reveal itself as a place where presence can live. And this is where our path now continues next, into the story of a monastery cook who believed he had been kept away from spiritual life until he discovered that even chopping vegetables and washing dishes could become a doorway to peace. And so, the path continues, in the most ordinary direction of all, into daily work repetition and the quiet tasks that so many people dismiss as spiritually unimportant. By this point, the teaching has become clear in many forms. Peace is not found only in special moments. It is not reserved for mountaintop silent rooms or rare seasons when life finally becomes manageable. It is something that can be carried into breath, into relationships, into uncertainty, into listening, into work, and into the simple goodness of ordinary experience. But even after hearing this, many people still quietly believe that real spiritual life must happen somewhere else, in some more sacred setting, in some more elevated kind of activity. The next story begins exactly there, with a man who believed he had been placed too far from the center of spiritual life to truly touch it. In a remote monastery many generations ago, there lived a monk whom we will call Brother Thomas. He had entered monastic life with sincere devotion. He loved the teachings, admired the older monks, and longed for awakening with the same earnest heart that had drawn so many seekers before him. Yet when duties were assigned, he was not sent to long hours of formal meditation, philosophical study, or the quiet copying of sacred texts. Instead, he was assigned to the kitchen. Day after day, he chopped vegetables, scrubbed pots, carried water, prepared rice, washed bowls, swept the floor, and cleaned up after others had finished eating. While the other monks sat in the meditation hall at dawn and dusk, Brother Thomas was often still busy, lighting fires, boiling water, or readying the next meal. Outwardly, he accepted his duties without complaint, but inwardly, a quiet disappointment had taken root. He began to believe that he had somehow been placed on the edge of the real path, close enough to serve it perhaps, but not close enough to live it fully. As the months passed, that disappointment deepened into a subtle bitterness. He watched the monks moving in and out of the hall with their robes quiet and composed, and he imagined that they were advancing while he remained spiritually stuck among steam ashes and dirty dishes. He told himself that once his kitchen duties ended, then his true practice would begin. Once he had more time, more silence, more stillness, more ideal conditions, then perhaps he too would touch the peace he longed for. Until then, he felt trapped inside routine. This is such a familiar human thought. We imagine that meaning lives elsewhere. We imagine that the real life, the real peace, the real beginning is waiting behind our current obligations. And so we move through the present moment as though it were only an obstacle standing in the way of something more sacred later on. One evening, after many weeks of carrying this hidden frustration, Brother Thomas finally went to speak with the abbot. The old teacher was seated quietly near the garden, watching the last light settle over the stones. Brother Thomas bowed and with some shame confessed the unrest that had been growing in him. He spoke honestly. He said that he had come to the monastery to awaken, but instead, he felt buried in chores. He said that his days disappeared into onions, soot water buckets, and endless washing. He said that while others sat in silence, he remained tangled in labor. "Master," he asked, "when will I be given time for real practice?" The abbot listened without interrupting. Then he looked at Brother Thomas with a kind expression, not mocking him, not correcting him harshly, but seeing clearly the misunderstanding that had taken hold. "Who told you?" the old teacher asked, "that the kitchen is outside the path?" Brother Thomas was silent. The abbot continued, "When you wash a bowl, are you not washing a bowl? When you cut vegetables, are you not cutting vegetables? When your mind resists the task, compares itself to others, and dreams of a more spiritual moment elsewhere, what is that resistance, if not the very thing you came here to understand?" Brother Thomas felt the truth of those words before he could fully think about them. The abbot was not dismissing meditation. He was pointing to something deeper. The problem was not the kitchen. The problem was the mind that kept insisting the kitchen could not possibly be sacred. Then the teacher gave him a simple instruction. "Tomorrow," he said, "do all your work as though it were the only practice you will ever be given. When you wash a pot, only wash the pot. When you carry water, only carry water. Feel the warmth, feel the weight, hear the sounds. Notice each moment you disappear into resentment or comparison and gently return. Let the kitchen become your meditation hall." There was nothing dramatic in the instruction, and perhaps that was what made it so powerful. It gave Brother Thomas no escape into grand ideas. It sent him directly back into the life he was already living. So the next morning before dawn, he entered the kitchen and began again. But this time, he tried to work differently. As he rinsed rice in a wooden bowl, he noticed the cool water over his fingers. As he arranged the vegetables, he saw their colors more clearly than he had in months. As he chopped, he listened to the sound of the knife meeting the board. When irritation arose, he noticed it. When comparison returned, he noticed that too. And instead of following those thoughts into old frustration, he came back to the simple reality of the task before him. Chop, wash, stir, carry, sweep, return, again and again. The day passed in this way, and by evening he felt strangely changed. The outer duties had not altered at all. The same kitchen, the same fire, the same bowls, the same labor. And yet the day had felt quieter, less divided. He had not been fighting it in the same way. He continued the practice the next day and the next, and little by little, the kitchen began to reveal itself differently. Steam rising from a pot became something beautiful to watch. The rhythm of preparing food became steadying rather than dull. Even washing dishes, once the symbol of his resentment, became a place of peace when he stopped treating the moment as disposable. He realized that much of his suffering had come not from the work itself, but from the thought that this is not where my life is supposed to be. Once that thought loosened, the work was no longer a punishment. It became a form of attention, a training in humility, a practice of presence, a way of serving others without needing recognition. And in that service, his heart grew quieter. In time, the other monks began noticing the change in him. Brother Thomas moved more slowly, but not lazily, more carefully, but not anxiously. There was a calmness in the way he poured tea, the way he set bowls, in order the way he wiped the tables after meals. His work carried the same quality of steadiness that people usually associate with formal meditation. One day the abbot passed through the kitchen, watched him for a moment and smiled. Nothing more needed to be said. Brother Thomas had discovered what the teachings have been revealing in so many forms all along. Peace is not hidden in some other life. It is found in this one when attention is whole and the heart stops arguing with the shape of the present moment. And once that is seen, even more clearly, another truth begins to open. If washing bowls can be sacred, if chopping vegetables can become meditation, then perhaps what we are searching for has never been as far away as we imagined. Perhaps awakening itself is not a distant treasure hidden somewhere beyond ordinary life, but something already present, waiting to be recognized in the very middle of it. That is where the path now turns next, toward a seeker who traveled far in search of enlightenment, only to discover that what he had been seeking had been quietly accompanying him from the beginning. And so, the path turns from the monastery kitchen to an even subtler discovery. Once Brother Thomas had learned that washing bowls could be sacred, another possibility began to shine through the teachings more clearly than ever. If presence can be found in chopping vegetables, if peace can appear while warm water runs over the hands, then perhaps awakening is not hidden in some faraway place after all. Perhaps what we are searching for is not absent. Perhaps it is simply overlooked, so close, so constant, so natural that the seeking mind keeps looking past it. The next story enters that mystery very gently through a seeker who had traveled far, practiced sincerely, and still felt that the peace he longed for remained just beyond his reach. There was once a devoted student whom we will call Jun. For many years, he had given himself completely to spiritual practice. He had studied with respected teachers, memorized sacred texts, and disciplined his body and mind with remarkable sincerity. He visited monasteries in distant mountains. He sat for long hours in meditation legs, aching breath, steady determination, unbroken. He practiced walking meditation, chanting silence reflection, and every form of discipline he encountered. Yet in spite of all this effort, the peace others spoke of seemed to elude him. Every time he thought he was nearing some final understanding, it slipped away like mist at sunrise. The more earnestly he searched, the more distant enlightenment seemed to become. Slowly, frustration entered his practice, and with frustration came a quiet despair. He began to wonder whether perhaps some people were simply not meant for awakening, whether perhaps the path belonged to others more naturally than it belonged to him. This is such a human sorrow. To work hard, to seek honestly, to give your best efforts to something beautiful, and still to feel as though the door has not opened. Many people know this feeling even outside formal spiritual life. They work to become calmer, kinder, wiser, less anxious, less reactive, and yet some old unease remains. They read, reflect, meditate, improve, heal, and still feel that peace lives somewhere ahead of them, in a future version of themselves they have not yet become. Jun carried exactly this burden. He was not lazy. He was not insincere. If anything, he was burdened by too much effort, too much striving, too much belief that enlightenment must be something gained through reaching farther and farther away from the life already in front of him. At last, weary from years of searching, Jun heard of an old woman known throughout the region for her quiet wisdom. She lived alone in a modest cottage at the edge of a forest, tending a small garden and welcoming the occasional seeker who found the narrow path to her door. Jun decided to visit her perhaps as a final attempt before surrendering his hope altogether. By the time he arrived, evening had begun to settle over the land. The The cottage was simple, almost plain, and yet there was something unmistakably peaceful about it. Flowers glowed softly in the fading light. The garden seemed to rest in its own silence. And on the small porch sat the old woman watching clouds drift slowly across the darkening sky, as though she were in no hurry to arrive anywhere else. Jun felt his restless heart quiet a little the moment he entered her presence. He bowed respectfully and spoke with great honesty. He told her of his years of study, his many teachers, his long efforts, and his growing discouragement. He told her that he had sought enlightenment in monasteries, texts, meditation halls, and mountain retreats, yet the peace he longed for always seemed just out of reach. "Master," he said softly, "please tell me where enlightenment can be found." The old woman looked at him with deep kindness. She did not answer immediately. Instead, she lifted one hand and pointed toward the sky, where the first stars had begun to appear in the deepening twilight. "Do you see those stars?" she asked. June, puzzled by the simplicity of the question, looked up and said yes. Then she asked another, "And do you see the space that holds them?" June looked up again, and in that quiet moment, something shifted. For years, he had focused only on the stars themselves, the bright points, the visible objects, the experiences that seemed meaningful, special, or spiritually significant. He had been searching for enlightenment in teachings, techniques, insights, sensations, and states of mind, the bright stars of the spiritual journey. But now, as he gazed into the vast darkness surrounding them, he realized he had overlooked something far more constant. The space was not empty in any barren sense. It was full of stillness, full of quiet presence. It held everything without strain, without demand, without reaching, without asking to be noticed. The stars could shine only because that vastness was already there, supporting them, containing them, allowing them to appear and disappear without itself being disturbed. And as June looked, he began to feel that the same truth existed within him. A kind of dawn opened inside his understanding. He saw that all these years he had been seeking enlightenment, as if it were some extraordinary star to be grasped, some final state, to be achieved, some special experience that would arrive and remain forever. But enlightenment in the deeper sense was not any particular experience. It was more like the vast awareness in which all experiences arise and pass. Thoughts came and went within it. Emotions came and went within it. Joy, sorrow, hope, fear, striving, calm, memory, longing, all of them appeared like stars in the open sky of awareness. Yet the awareness itself remained, quiet, spacious, already present, already here. It had never been absent from him. He had simply been too busy chasing the stars to notice the sky. The old woman smiled when she saw the change in his face. Then she spoke gently in words he would carry for the rest of his life. "You have been like someone searching everywhere for their glasses while already wearing them. The peace you seek has been the very awareness with which you were seeking." Those words did not flatter him. They freed him. He understood, perhaps for the first time, that his deepest nature had never needed to be improved into worthiness. The awareness that knew his thoughts, knew his effort, knew his frustration, knew his longing, that awareness had been constant through all of it. It was not something fragile to be manufactured. It was the quiet home in which all striving had been taking place. From that evening onward, Jun's relationship with practice changed completely. He did not stop meditating. He did not stop learning. But the tone of the path softened. Practice was no longer a desperate attempt to become someone else. It became a way of resting more consciously in what had always been true. He stopped searching for peace somewhere far away and began noticing the awareness already present in each moment, in breathing, in walking, in listening, in sorrow, in joy, even in silence before sleep. And this story points very gently towards something you can notice even now. There is an awareness here reading these words, hearing them inwardly, sensing your breath, sensing your body, knowing your thoughts as they rise and fade. You do not need to create that awareness. It is already here, as natural as the night sky. The path from here becomes even softer because once this is seen, even briefly, thoughts themselves lose some of their power to disturb the deeper silence that holds them. And that is where our journey now continues next. And so, the path grows softer still, because once awareness is recognized as the quiet sky in which all experience appears, a new question naturally arises. If awareness remains open and still beneath thought, then what are we to do with the endless movement of the mind itself? What are we to do with distraction, memory planning, worry, regret, imagination, and the thousand small currents of thought that seem to flow without invitation, especially in the quiet moments when we most long for peace? Many people believe that inner silence means the complete absence of thought, and because thoughts continue to appear, they assume they have failed. But the teachings point somewhere far more compassionate and far more liberating than that. Silence is not destroyed by the presence of thought. Just as the sky is not harmed by passing birds, the deeper stillness of awareness is not broken simply because the mind continues to move. It is only when we become entangled in those movements, believing each one must be followed, solved, or resisted, that we lose sight of the silence that was present all along. There was once a monk who lived in a small hermitage near a waterfall deep in the mountains. The place was simple and beautiful, almost hidden from the world. Moss grew over smooth stones. Pines leaned quietly over the path. In the warm months, light filtered through the leaves in trembling patterns, and in the cold months, mist gathered low over the earth before the sun had fully risen. The waterfall itself was the heart of the place. It poured ceaselessly over dark rock, filling the air with its steady music day and night. Travelers who occasionally found their way to the hermitage would often speak of how peaceful it felt there, as though the very sound of the falling water washed agitation from the mind. And yet the monk who lived beside that waterfall was not at peace. Every morning he sat to meditate, and every morning his mind filled with thoughts. Old memories appeared. Plans for the coming days formed themselves. Regrets returned uninvited. Small irritations from long ago resurfaced, as though they had been waiting for silence to make themselves heard again. He would try to focus on the breath, but the mind wandered. He would return to posture, but another chain of thought would begin. He would listen to the waterfall, hoping the sound would quiet everything within him, but the thinking mind continued almost without pause. Over time, he grew discouraged. The place around him was serene. The teachings were clear. The conditions seemed ideal, and still his mind would not become silent. At last, he began to believe that something essential was wrong with him, that perhaps other people were made for contemplation, and he was not. One day, after many weeks of this inward struggle, an old, wandering teacher came to visit the hermitage. The monk received him with great respect, served him tea, and after some time confessed the burden that had been weighing on him. He spoke honestly. He said that he lived beside one of the most peaceful sounds in the world, and yet he could not find peace in himself. He said that thoughts filled his meditation like birds swarming through a field. He said that no matter how beautiful the setting, he could not make his mind stay quiet. "Master," he asked, "how can I find silence when thoughts keep disturbing it?" The old teacher did not answer immediately. Instead, he gestured toward the waterfall and asked the monk to listen. So they sat together in stillness for several minutes, the water thundering over stones, steady and unchanged. Then the teacher asked, "Do you hear the waterfall?" The monk said yes. "And do you hear the birds in the trees?" Again the monk said yes, because scattered among the rush of water, there were indeed birds calling in the branches above them. The teacher asked another question. "Do the birds destroy the waterfall?" The monk looked confused and said no. Of course not. The waterfall continued exactly as it was, whether birds sang or fell silent. Then the old teacher turned toward him with a gentle smile and said, "Your thoughts are like those birds. The silence beneath them is like the waterfall. You keep trying to stop the birds, believing that only then will you hear the water clearly. But the water has never stopped." The monk sat very still as those words entered him. In a single moment, he recognized the mistake he had been making. He had imagined that silence was something fragile, something broken each time a thought appeared. He had been waiting for the mind to become perfectly empty before allowing himself to trust the peace beneath it. But the teacher was showing him another way. Thoughts did not need to be destroyed. They did not need to be feared. They did not even need to be followed. They could come and go like birds crossing the sky, while the deeper current of awareness continued beneath them, constant and untouched. From that day on, the monk's practice changed. When thoughts appeared, he no longer treated them as intruders ruining the meditation. He simply noticed them the way one notices a bird passing overhead. Memory was here. Planning was here. Restlessness was here. Then gently he returned to listening, not forcing, not fighting, just listening. And as he listened more deeply, he began to hear that the waterfall had indeed been there the entire time. The sound of presence, the sound of awareness, the sound of life unfolding without asking the mind's permission. His thoughts still came. Some days they came in great flocks, but they no longer convinced him that peace had vanished. He had learned that peace was deeper than the movement of mind. This is such a tender and necessary lesson, especially for those who struggle at night. Many people lie awake believing that sleep or peace can come only after every thought has been resolved. They try to clear the mind by force. They argue with worry. They become frustrated by their own mental activity, and that frustration creates even more noise. But what if the goal is not to eliminate thought completely? What if the invitation is simply to stop treating each thought as a crisis? A thought about tomorrow may pass through. A memory may rise. A fear may whisper. Let it be a bird, not a command. Let it pass through the open sky of awareness without requiring your full participation. Beneath it, the deeper current remains. Breath is still here. The body is still lying safely on the bed. The night is still holding you. Silence has not been destroyed. It is only waiting beneath the surface, as it always was. This also changes the way we understand meditation itself. Meditation is not the manufacture of perfect mental weather. It is the gradual recognition that you are not identical to every thought that appears. You are the awareness that notices thought. You are the stillness that can hear mental noise without becoming it. You are the open field in which weather changes, not the weather alone. Once this is felt even briefly, the mind loses some of its power to frighten itself. Thoughts may continue, but they no longer seem so absolute. They become events rather than identity movements, rather than destiny. And perhaps that is why this old story remains so comforting. It tells us that peace is not as fragile as we feared. A passing thought does not break it. An emotion does not cancel it. Even a restless mind does not exile us from it forever. The waterfall continues. Awareness continues. The deeper silence remains. And once the heart begins to trust that it can finally stop struggling so hard to manufacture peace and begin resting in the peace that was quietly here from the beginning. From here, the journey has only one last movement to make. Not towards some new teaching, but toward a final softening, a final return home. The path now turns toward a quiet hermit, a small wildflower, and the gentle understanding that happiness is not something we conquer or possess, but something that is revealed when grasping loosens, and the heart becomes simple again. And now, as this long and gentle journey comes to rest, you do not need to hold on to every story, every teaching, or every image that has passed before you tonight. You do not need to remember each lesson in perfect detail. You do not need to solve anything more. Let the words become softer now. Let them drift down beneath the surface of thought like leaves settling onto still water. Let them become less like ideas to understand and more like a quiet feeling of warmth resting somewhere deep within you. The path we have walked tonight has always been leading here, not toward effort, not toward striving, not toward becoming someone new, but toward this simple, peaceful return to what has been here all along. Perhaps tonight you heard something your heart needed. Perhaps it was the reminder that suffering softens when grasping softens. Perhaps it was the understanding that peace does not wait in some distant future, but can be touched right here beneath the noise of the restless mind. Perhaps it was the image of the open hand, or the quiet compassion of loving kindness, or the gentle wisdom of impermanence. Perhaps it was the sound of the waterfall beneath the birds, the sky behind the stars, or the small wildflower blooming without fear of how brief its season might be. Whatever stayed with you, let it stay lightly. There is no need to cling even to wisdom. The deepest truths do not need to be forced into memory. They remain in the heart in their own way, and they return when they are needed. So now let your body begin to loosen whatever it is still holding. Let the muscles around your eyes soften. Let your jaw unclench. Let your tongue rest gently. Let the shoulders drop a little lower. Let the chest be easy. Let the hands release whatever invisible weight they may still be carrying. If there is tension in your stomach, let the breath move there with kindness. If there is heaviness in the heart, Let it be held, very gently. Nothing needs to be pushed away tonight. Nothing needs to be fixed before rest is allowed. You are allowed to be exactly as you are in this moment, a little tired, a little tender, still healing, still becoming, and still worthy of peace. If thoughts are still moving, let them move. You do not need to chase them, and you do not need to fight them. Let them pass like distant birds crossing the wide sky of awareness. Beneath them, the deeper silence remains. Beneath them, breath is still here. Beneath them, the body is still lying safely in this moment. Beneath them, there is still something quiet and steady holding you. You do not need to make that silence happen. You only need to stop struggling so hard against the mind and gently return to the simple rhythm of breathing in and breathing out. Let each breath tell the body that the day is over now. Let each exhale carry away a little more effort, a little more pressure, a little more of the need to keep solving, keep holding everything together. You have done enough for today. You have carried enough for today. Whatever remains unfinished can wait beyond the edge of sleep. Tomorrow does not need to be lived tonight. The future does not need to be solved in the dark. For now, there is only this quiet room, this resting body, this slow breath, and the soft permission to let go. Let the mind stop reaching. Let the heart stop bracing. Let the night hold what you no longer need to carry by yourself. And as you rest here, perhaps you can remember one final truth from all we have shared tonight. Peace is not a reward given only after life becomes perfect. It is not reserved for those who have no worries, no sorrow, no fear, and no unfinished questions. Peace begins the moment you stop demanding that life becomes something else before you allow yourself to rest inside it. Peace begins when the hand opens, when the breath softens, when the heart says, "For just this moment, nothing more is required. I am here. I am held. I can rest now." May your mind grow quiet in its own natural way. May your body feel safe enough to soften into sleep. May any sorrow within you be met with tenderness. May any fear within you loosen and fade. May your heart remember its own quiet strength. And may you be carried gently into deep and healing rest. Thank you for spending this peaceful time with the long night, a quiet place to return to soften and to rest. May the night be kind to you. May your dreams be gentle, and may you sleep deeply, peacefully, and well. Good night.